So I'll call the meeting to order. I need to add one thing to the agenda and I think change one thing on the agenda. So in the consent agenda, I'd like to add the minutes from the book read section of the November 27th meeting, and you have all gotten those. And the second thing, Beth, I need to double check with you, but the transportation policy is second reading, right? We don't do, we don't do third, right? We don't do third readings, so just change that word. Okay, so with that, we always open with comments from the public on items not on the agenda. Jason, hello?
No, if I'm going to comment on an item on the agenda, wait till that appropriate time.
You should wait until we get to that agenda item. Okay?
I will do so.
Great, thanks. So, does anyone need to pull anything from the consent agenda? Diane?
I'd like to pull the minutes for December 4th.
Okay. Anything else? All right, then I'll entertain a motion. Do you want to make the motion, Martha?
I move that we approve the consent agenda with the following items. November 27th, 2018, the portion of the book read minutes and approval of warrants.
Okay. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. Diane?
Hello. All right, here we go. So I'm pulling the minutes because as I was reading it, it'll talk about in pursuit of, and it's in twice, in pursuit of some legislative numbers and whatever else. Shouldn't it be pursuant? Because we're not running after something. We're following something in accordance with the law that's cited. So can the language be changed to pursuant the legislative numbers?
I think they've been warning it on the agenda, so I think Martha added that into the minutes after I did them, exactly how it showed up on the agenda.
So which section are you talking about, Diane? I'm confused. Oh, it should be pursuant to.
Yeah, pursuant to.
Right.
As
Maybe it was wrong on the agenda in the first place. Okay.
But I'd like to have that corrected.
Yeah, it's in two places,
Yes.
Kim. It's both in, it's in the two sections on an executive session. One at the beginning of the meeting and one at the end. Is that everyone okay with that? All right, I'll entertain a motion to approve the minutes of December 4th as corrected.
So moved.
Thanks, Liz. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed say nay. All right, great. Well, we have invited legislators, representatives, and senators to join us tonight so we can have a little discussion about what's upcoming. I pass around papers with the items on it that we want to talk about. What I thought we would do is that Beth, Brian, Kim, and I are going to shortly explain each item, and then we'll go to each of you and ask you to comment on any of the items that you would like to comment on. it occurs to me as I say that it may not be as much of a conversation as we want. So let's see how it goes. So I'll pass these around, and Beth is going to, yeah. Okay, Beth is going to start us off with an item that came up for us this summer, and we have been working with Dylan to have legislation drafted. So Beth, would you like to talk about that?
So we would like to see when a teacher is put on a child protection registry, that a school district is informed. So it could happen outside. If it happened in the school, we would know. But if it happens outside, we've had incidences where we do not find out. So it would be very helpful that we get a call from that also, so to know that, and we can be put and warned about it happening also. We feel like we should work with them on that.
The second item is Act 46. And no surprise to you, probably, our board hopes that you will stick with the plan. Many school districts, as part of selling merger to their communities, said if we don't do this, the state's going to do it to us. So to back away from that now, I think makes the state lose a lot of credibility. The one area of conversation that has come up from the districts that have been asked by the state board to merge that makes some sense to us is that it's pretty hard to create a budget for a merged district given that it's already December. So I think delaying the implementation of the merger for a year could certainly make some sense. Okay, we're going to move to Brian.
Yeah, so the legislature last year went on to require that all SUs and SDs adopt a shared financial and HR system, and that they are to implement that system by July 1, 2020, with a few exceptions regarding districts that are still in the process of merger or had purchased, but all districts coming on board by 21. And I think that it's asking encouragement that no further exceptions be made and that we do go forward. That statewide data house or warehouse of data can be incredibly valuable for us. And it, I think, also provides some sustainability to the industry of running the finances and HR of our school business. It's well over a $2 billion endeavor at this point in time. On the dashboard and the completion, the educational quality dashboard will connect with the state longitudinal data system, and will be providing an annual snapshot of district's work and so forth. That work and supporting of the SLDS, especially in these first few years, could be helpful. So continuing to fund that or fund it in additional capacity at the AOE level so that they have the resources to support the field. We're finding in a number of cases that there's data that can't be generated, services that can't be provided, or support that isn't available to districts because of where the AOE is right now with staffing and bandwidth. And then finally, the climate survey. The agency has chosen to adopt the U.S. Department of Education School Climate Survey, which is great news. It replaces what our district was doing previously. to a degree, but it's not including parent input, and it's only including a selection of grades at this point in time is the current plan. Now, I say that that's the current plan because it's only being piloted right now, and it's not expected to come out until spring, but it could be a major role, as it talks about, in giving student voice to their education, but I think also parent voice to their education is equally important. And there's a lack of definition of where that information necessarily, how it will get back down to districts, how it will be able to be sort of broken apart and seen, and also how it will be reported at a statewide level. So it's a great initiative. It requires a little bit more further definition and potentially some consideration of expanding its population and who it surveys regarding the educational product that we're providing, including parents.
Okay, I'm going to move to Kim.
In thinking about Act 166 and modifications to that, I know there was a study, the think tank recommendations, and I think some of the concerns, not having read the study in its entirety, but just some of the concerns that we may share are related to the accessibility for families when 10 hours is what we're reimbursing, and the concern that we could in fact be furthering the divide, because those who can access just 10 hours may have the financial resources to be providing those 10 hours. And if getting students to and from, providing for those who are disabled in an equitable manner, I think the intent is certainly good, but that the law itself has us, even if we were willing or able to offer a full day pre-K, we would be reimbursed at the fractional pre-K student range. So there's a number of considerations that I think are unintended consequences, and the results of which have yet to be really provided in terms of data, but seem intuitively concerning to furthering our gap versus supporting those who are most in need to get access to high quality pre-K that can benefit certainly all of us along the way, but we know if we get to it early for students, the longer term expenses in special ed on a broader data set would tell us that we can head off some of the biggest challenges for students and districts.
Thanks, Kim. Beth.
So I think this next one is a plea from regional superintendents as well as myself in this school district, is to allow us to get really good at the laws that are being implemented and allow us the time to do that. And as you know, we are a big district. It does take a little longer to implement something. I think with Act 77, this district, as that came along, I wasn't here at that time, and they chose to take the route of getting internships and dual enrollment, and that's going along really well. We still need time with personalized learning plans, and I think those were implemented in the middle schools, and they need to move along and come up through. So there were different avenues that you could attack when Act 77 came out, and I think Essex Westford School District did a good job attacking the pieces they attacked at that time. But we do need time to implement it well and really see the student outcomes from that. And it's exciting. Act 77 is a great law, and it's very student-based, but we need to see those outcomes before we have something else that we implement. With Act 173 is great. We're really excited about how we can be flexible with funding, and that it's focused on struggling students, not just special education, that we can focus on struggling readers and mathematicians, and that we have that freedom with the funds to figure out how we can do it best. So that's really exciting. And that's going to be a challenge to figure that out. And we have already begun those conversations with our principals and special educators and looking at implementing that law. And it's, we are extremely excited, and Brian can say that too as a financial, from finance, and it's, again, that's student outcomes, and that's wonderful, but we need time to really do it well. so we would appreciate that for all those things that come along. Let us get really good at something.
On the same vein of time and also some stability and predictability for our voters on budgets, is to perhaps consider that changes to the Ed Fund formula not apply to budgets that have been voted by their local communities. We start our budgeting process in some of the earliest in the nation, and we are finishing our budgeting process in some of the latest in the nation. And that creates a real, sometimes, disconnect between the work that is done by school boards to inform the public to what ultimately happens to the public with tax rates and changes. So it's just trying to recognize changing the game halfway through. It gets to be a confusing process.
Thanks. Kim?
I think it's a theme that I was describing in the pre-K, but that new public investments in early care should continue to look at access and for those most in need, and figure out how we can do our best to support that, and thinking about how our agencies work together to do that effectively. Maybe a youth cabinet that looks at cradle to career. But I think for years we've heard talk of our agencies working well together, and I think some parts of the laws that have come in have been especially challenging to school districts and our other agencies in coordinating who's in charge of which pieces of these laws. So I would invite as much collaboration as could actually come out of it, because there's been a lot of good intention around that, but I don't know that we've noticed that it's been executed on in a way that is helpful for schools and families.
We worked with Dylan and Phil last year to get 2 pieces of language into law around unified union boards. And the first one says that new board members will be elected by the school district, not by the municipalities. We had some real confusion here last year because the votes for board members were on the municipal ballots, and the boundaries in the town and village are different for municipal matters than they are for our school district. And the second piece was about how board members would be replaced if a vacancy should occur. And it says that the replacement will be voted on by board, not by the municipality, but with recommendation or with consultation with the municipality. The Agency of Education really asked that that language be sunsetted because they want to rewrite the whole Unified Union Statute. So we want to make sure that happens and that we don't end up in a place where the language we got sunsets and we get back into a challenging situation with election and board members. Okay? So I wanted to make sure that each of you got to speak. So I'm going to go around first and ask each of you to introduce yourself and talk about any pieces here that you are interested in, or ask us questions if you have them. And then perhaps there'll be time for a more open dialogue afterwards. Okay? So I'm going to start with Chris. We all have name plaques, so I guess I'm not going to do the introduction thing. Okay.
Well, thank you, Martha. Thanks for having us. I'm Chris Pearson. I'm one of your senators here in Chittenden, and I was just reelected, so I'm about to begin my second term. I'm also married to a public school teacher. Lacey teaches at CVU, social studies, so some of your issues are in my house in a different way. Prior to being in the Senate, I served with Martha in the House for many years on behalf of a small slice of Burlington. I have sort of, my focus on issues related to education have been more around equitable financing. I have noticed in the 12 or so years I've been in Montpelier that the property tax discussion is very top of mind, and at some level I believe interrupts our ability to dig in a little bit and make sure we're looking at quality education and curriculum and as a broad state community. Often what we hear about is property tax. So I've been poking around alternatives, potentially looking to expand income sensitivity to everybody, have more equity that way. Also, recently we've been bubbling up the idea that a great pressure on our schools, and I'd love to understand if this resonates, is actually not in curriculum or education so much as what we might think of as social work. And perhaps one solution Montpelier could look at is reflecting that in the general fund as opposed to the ed fund, which means putting the pressure where it really belongs on the income tax, not the property tax, and trying to more smoothly integrate with community services we already have around social work. I'd love to understand if that makes sense and if that's worth pursuing. I hear about it. I'm not aware of concrete proposals. It's a big task, but that does, as I talk to educators, that often sort of, I get a lot of head nodding. And so I'm curious if I'd be curious if folks think that is worth digging into. It's not a one session kind of idea though.
Definitely. Why don't we talk about that in a minute? Ginny.
Thank you. I'm Ginny Lyons, also one of your senators, and I've been a senator for many years. So it's actually a pleasure to be here tonight to listen to your concerns, because the concerns that we hear, I would reiterate what Chris has said, we hear more about property taxes than we do about how are the kids doing in school. So it's actually refreshing to hear that your interests are probably, they're actually more in line with my interests, but so that's good, I guess. I'm also interested in property taxes, but if I were a teacher or a child in school today and all I heard about was how overly expensive it is to teach and to teach a kid in school, I guess I might be an unhappy child. So the one issue here that I think I'd like to address first, because I know there'll be a lot of discussion from others, is the working with kids who are most vulnerable. And so I'm a member of our Justice Oversight Committee, which is a combination of those looking at institutional monies for the state, looking at the judiciary, and then also looking at health care. And as I think about most vulnerable, I think about a program that's just beginning with the judiciary, where there's a huge amount of money being invested, $7 million over the next several years, to look at how we can intervene when a parent is incarcerated, or when a family is influenced by someone who has opioid abuse or other addiction. And it goes right to the heart of thinking about how we cope with these problems in schools, and how can we link families and children with the counseling that they need, and then because the question is, the chicken and egg question is, do we link with the kids and work only with the children and ensure that they're safe and that we prevent adverse experiences with them, whether they're at home or in foster care or at school? Or are we looking at the family situation and offering support for the families? So it's a combo, and I'd be very interested to hear what your thoughts are about how you deal with some of these issues, because we all know that so many families are affected by addiction, and when the family gets to the court system, that's the last. I mean, that could be a horrific step for the child, whatever age. So I'm interested in hearing your thoughts about that as well as other things, but I'll just sort of stop now and let Philip wax enthusiastic.
So I'm Phil Baruth. I was the chair of Senate Education the last 2 years. It's my hope to do it again. And so I'll stick to the list here because I feel as though I'm in almost perfect sync with everything you say. I suppose the bullet point that talks about allowing time for implementing current laws before instituting new ones, I would see that as the theme for these 2 years. If you think about what's out there, and I know that thinking is behind your bullet point, but add to that Act 173 with an entire rewrite of the special education system. I was talking to the superintendent about the July 19 date for starting that increased flexibility of funding. That's going to take a lot of pre-planning, and this coming year is going to be crucial to that. But pre-K has risen also to the top in terms of attending to that law and its rollout. So if I had my way, there wouldn't be a major new piece of legislation for you to worry about. Act 46 also is in need of endgame and tying up. So I'm very much in line with your way of thinking. By sticking to the plan, I take you to be saying we don't want 2 tracks where we followed one, and now that we're in the end game, the people who were stubborn, maybe to use that word, would be allowed an off-ramp from merging. All I can say to you is I've been doing Act 46 under that title and other titles for the last 8 years. I have absolutely no intention of letting anybody out from under their obligations in that law. With that said, you show, I think, real wisdom in talking about more time. That's something I'm thinking about as well. The other thing I'm thinking about is small school grants are scheduled to go away for people who haven't merged by now, whether they merge under the forced mergers or not. I don't think that's fully equitable. So my approach, which I will present to the committee if I chair it, will be to say that if you merge, whether it's via forced merger or not, we will look at making sure you keep your small school grant. That way, if the agency and the board didn't recommend that you merge, you've satisfied Act 46. If you've already merged, you've satisfied Act 46. Or if you're forced to merge, you've also satisfied it. So everybody should be treated equally with regard to the small school grant. But yeah, I don't think, for instance, that districts who didn't set up a study committee at all should be given a great deal of leeway. So there's time for other discussion, but in general, everything here, including notifying school districts about the Child Protection Registry, that all makes eminently good sense, and I'm pretty much with you on everything.
Well, Senator Baruth is a tough act to follow. I'm Debbie Ingram. I'm also on the Senate Education Committee, but I definitely feel as Mr. Act 46 and knows all of the how it applies to every single small town in Vermont. So So I can't compete with that, but I would just really echo what he has just said. I mean, we worked very hard on trying to make some tweaks to Act 46 that would be an accommodation to some of the smaller towns throughout the state, and but one thing that we were all, I think, quite united on is that we want to stick with the plan. You know, as Martha said, you know, you can't change the rules in the middle of the game, and people were told at the beginning that if they didn't do the merger themselves, then the state was gonna do that for them, and that needs to continue to be the plan. Kim's remarks about pre-K and especially about our most vulnerable families really resonated with me. I have a background in working for social justice, but again, I think the whole committee was pretty much. Of course, it will be reconstituted, and there will for sure be different people on it because some of the people didn't come back. But I think that will continue to be foremost in our minds. I think it's really inadequate for us to only fund 10 hours anyway, and if we could possibly find the funds to do better for our families. We talk all the time about wanting to attract families and wanting to make sure that we have the skilled workforce, and one way that we can do that is to make sure that we have the absolute best education pre-K through 12 for those families. So I'm pretty much with you as well. So I'll just leave it there.
Thanks, Doug. Bob?
Maybe you can hear me. I'm supportive of each one of these issues, and I am supportive of pre-K, although I'm not so sure that I understood all the issues with it, so I may need a little help in understanding that. The major thing that I'm interested in is a bill that I submitted 2 years or 3 years ago that would allow a small percentage of students from a school to transfer to another school, and where some money would go with that student. And the receiving schools couldn't deny entrance unless they had a waiver from the Department of Education. And I will be submitting that bill again this year.
My name is Mary Beth Redmond. I'm newly elected state representative for the town of Essex. I'm really thrilled to be here. I have a son who is a 10th grader here at Essex High School, and have followed his journey through the Essex Public Schools. At the same time, I have also accompanied a family over the last 14 years who also attend this school district, who are among some of the most vulnerable people in our community. So I've seen how the school system both works and doesn't work for children in that category. I am generally in alignment with all of this. I completely hear the plea for time to implement a lot of these things. In particular, Act 77, I've seen it implemented for my son at the middle school level, and I absolutely understand what you're talking about in terms of not really having the chance at the high school level to fully implement it. So I really hear that concern, and I think it's a good one. And lastly, I would say that the overwhelming thing that, in addition to property taxes, that I heard on the campaign trail this year had to do with people who do not have skilled workers. They cannot find the skilled workers that they need. And so any way that we can really, give our children the best education that they can so that they can become successful into the skilled workforce. And I'm very interested in the role that technical centers play in that as well. I'm 100% in for. So I'm the newbie on the block. I'm getting up to speed, but I'm really excited to jump in both feet and support public school education in the fullest of ways.
I'm Linda Myers. I'm starting my 9th term in the House of Representatives. in fact, I haven't had that much to do with education in all those years that I've been in the House, except for school construction, because for 15 years I served on the Institutions Committee. And when I first started, we were still funding the state was still funding school construction, until we got to a point where we realized that the state would never be able to maintain what we had been using. And the interesting thing is, in the past 2 months, I've gotten calls from other school districts asking me about, is school construction money ever going to come back? And basically, I have had to say, no, it is not, because right now, funding from the Institution Committee, from the money for construction is bonded money, which is approved every year by the Debt Affordability Committee, and they're lowering the debt we will be allowed to accrue this year, and in addition to which now, because of legislation that has been passed, we will be using some of that institution-provided money for the cleanup of the waters of the state. And so I've had to say no, that don't, I've explained that I'm no longer on the committee, but I also know that we're not going to be able to do that. What I am interested in that's got directly to do with education is, as Mary Beth mentioned, the vocational and technical educations in our schools, and coming up with the ability to offer that to ninth graders with right now it's pre-tech 10, full 11 and 12. What we envisioned, the Commerce Committee, we spent a lot of time working on it this past year. Pre-tech in 9, 10, 11, and 12 full, with the ability after that, because they've got 3 years in, to move right into apprenticeships, because that is what we are severely lacking. Young people who choose not to go on to higher education, but need skills to be able to go into the workforce. I had a young man come and fix my washing machine. And he was, I would say, in his, everybody's young to me, but we'll start. But the fact of the matter is, I would say he's probably, was probably in his late 20s, early 30s. So of course, being in the midst of all this discussion about vocational education, I said to him, tell me your story. He tells me that he lived in Milton, and he started high school in Milton, and he went his freshman and sophomore years, and he said, I was a wreck, I was terrible, I was causing problems, and he said his parents said to him, you have one choice. And he said, and what is that? And he said, you are going to the Essex Tech Center for your junior and senior year. He said, I went. I said, and he looked at me and just in the face, and he said to me, Essex Tech Center saved my life. So I said to him, and what happened? He said, I was able to go on, to get, he's now a plumber, to get his apprenticeship and his master's and everything. And I said, and how are you doing in your life? And he said, I was able to buy myself a new pickup truck. I bought a house with 10 acres of land. And he said, he had a wife and a child, and he said, and we're doing well. And he said, but it's what I learned at the Tech Center. And so what my committee and what we are thinking is, even starting in the middle schools with that little bit of an introduction, 8th grade, a little introduction to get them, because what every one of us has heard who's in the legislature is we may have a low unemployment rate in the state of Vermont, but we're businesses who are crying for workers. And so the education that we give our kids to move on to higher education, to college, is great, but I think we have to think about more about those kids who don't move on. And then I worked with Joe here in our adult education, and that's the other issue, because we send these kids to college, and 2 years later they come back, and now they're looking for something. And the issue with the adult tech education is there's no funding from the state or anywhere for those students. They've got to fork up the money themselves, so whether it's $4,000 or so, yeah, for that. So for me, the issue of education has boiled down to what we can do for this cohort of students that we need to address.
I'm Dylan Giambattista. I'm a state representative here in the village of Essex Junction. I have the real privilege to serve on the House Education Committee and have been working on the Vermont State College's Board of Trustees as well, where I serve as a board member. I'll keep my comments very brief. I'd like to have more of a dialogue as we get going here, but we really are looking at public education in this state in a time of tremendous change. And the change really is coming at a time where it's happening all across the country too. It's very difficult, I think, to deliver education, to work with our students in a changing world in which the environment, sort of the social backdrop, and the economic backdrop is always in flux. And I think that our young learners are experiencing that. And I think that they're trying to understand what it means to receive a public education as well. From my perspective, the things on your list, these are the fundamentals. I think it gives us a good roadmap as we get into the session. A couple of the issues are already moving. Some of them are yet to be determined. And I know that we always have a property tax, education finance fire drill around March. I expect we'll have one again. And if we do, I'll bring my hose along and see if we can put it out. But from my perspective, here's the thing. What districts are doing really well right now is bringing together really complex systems and trying to bring in the community voice, the voice of students, and a process of learning that is inclusive of all the ideas about how we ought to be doing it. And if we can continue and maintain that discipline, particularly around Act 77, giving voice to students, allowing student members of a board to actually be participants, to have a say in their future, I think it's going to really pay off and pay dividends over time. I'm hopeful that this coming legislative session, as we have our education policy discussions, we keep in mind what's at stake, because failure to provide public education is a threat to all of us. And I think we need to keep that in mind. We need to be open-minded, and I do expect that we'll make some good progress. It's said that governors have two places they can really make a change. They have healthcare policy and they have education. I think it's fair to say that the current governor and the previous governor focused on education policy. I expect they will continue to. So if we can be of any help, I'm happy to reach out to any of my colleagues here, and I'm happy to make myself available. I live less than a mile away. Brian knows where I live, so I have to show up when I'm called upon. So just let me know if I can be of help, and I really appreciate the opportunity.
Great.
Thanks.
So, thank you. That was helpful. I think I'd like to start a bit of a discussion around the issue of how social services and the education system interact or don't. We've been talking about this. I was in the legislature for 22 years. I've been out for 4. It was a topic of conversation all those years. So we recognize it as an issue. We haven't made much progress in terms of figuring it out. I'd love to hear your response, Beth.
So ready now?
Yeah.
The social and emotional learning curriculum or programs that we need to put in place, we, as a leadership team, which is the principals and our district administrators, we've really been thinking about what is the impact we can have with the Tier 1 in the classroom. We have written a why statement. Do you want me to read it to you? our why statement that we worked on the beginning of the month. In order to meet the needs of the whole child, we prioritize social and emotional learning of all students because it is the ultimate power standard. Social and emotional learning is the core to our students' individual and collective quality of life and learning. The research and our own district and school data identifies this as a critical to achieving our vision. It is a moral imperative that must be taught, modeled, and prioritized by all. So, that being said, that is our why. We know that this is where our focus has to be. We've been developing our budget priorities. It is definitely a budget priority for us. But that tier 1, we know we can affect, and we have to go back. We have implemented responsive classroom many years ago. We're getting retrained. Developmental design for the middle school, high schools now. The principal's very interested in that, which would be really helpful. So and restorative practices, revisiting that. So all those pieces have to be aligned. We also, as we said, model and teach. We need to model empathy, be kind, give hope, which is hard in today's world, and with parents, and we have children in foster care. We work with that system well. We try to keep them. My philosophy is if they're moving from house to house, if we can keep them stable and give them the love they need in one place at our school, don't tear them away from our school, even if we have to, transport the students. So we're trying to keep those, but it is a lot that's happening in these lives, for sure, and pretty sad. We really appreciate mental health. We have a person at the police department, but we share that with 3 other towns. So to have a full-time person there would be helpful. We know we can call that, which has been great, and the police department has used that. We work really closely with our police, and they come in often when we get to that tier 2, tier 3. But that's where we need more help. We know we have the work to do at tier 1 in our classrooms, first instruction, but tier 2 and tier 3. I had worked with a principal today in an incident that we were first call was who we were calling. So it's often.
Are you sharing a social worker that's in the police department? What other towns are sharing that?
I think we share with Colchester and Williston.
Yeah, so there's 3 individuals and they work in the 3 communities.
It's 2 or 3.
3.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I've met them and they're really very effective.
Yeah.
Yes.
But are you saying that we need more?
It would be nice to have a full-time one.
Okay.
I don't know how that gets paid for, but to have somebody there.
Well, and then we contract with Howard.
We do contract with Howard.
To have a social worker in, we have a presence of a social worker in all our schools. The case levels for those social workers is, reasonably small. I mean, so that they can do their work. But we have more need, and it needs to be wraparound need. It needs to be able to include home visits, so that work can be done. And so, yeah, that the health and human services interconnect with our public education is significant, though we haven't recognized it when we looked at the difference between general fund funding and ed funding. And it's, it's at a point right now, it is the gateway. There is nobody that's going to be able to be at grade level in their reading and their math comprehension and so forth if they are struggling, with some of the stuff that our kids are struggling with, or if they have a hungry belly. So I mean, these are the realities to have a civil society with an informed citizenry. They have to be people that are in a position to be able to learn, and they have to feel safe, and they have to be nourished, and they have to be encouraged.
And as Brian said, we do work with the Howard Center and appreciate all the work they do, and that they're in this area. That for sure is a big plus for us. I worked in the Northeast Kingdom. We didn't have the Howard Center. But when you contract with that, they have a smaller caseload, and we pay a lot of money for that. And one of the barriers is the parents have to sign a lot of paperwork to get the child to work. And as you talked about, families, right? We need the wraparound services for them also.
Well,
Could
and
you-
where's the point person for that? This is a really important conversation. I don't know if we're gonna solve it tonight, but, yeah.
Could you explain tier 1, 2, and 3 for the folks who weren't part of the special education
So the
discussion?
tier 1 is classroom,
Right.
first instruction with the classroom teacher. And tier 2 is intervention, so we have people like a Howard Center or somebody to come in to work with those when a student gets to that level. And then tier 3 is even larger than Howard Center, and having trained people or calling the police to come help. So there is the different levels that we work with, but we are, as a leadership team, really committed to putting some time and resources for teaching. I went to school to become a teacher. I didn't learn about social and emotional. I picked it up along the way and went to responsive classroom training and totally believed in it, but it's harder.
Could you say a little more about how you're implementing restorative practices? Is that like a part of your policy, your disciplinary policy, but is it also maybe more encompassing in terms of the way people just relate to one another in general?
Yes, it is definitely part of the policy. We do have more work to do around that, and the conversations that I've been having at the high school, we have a policy for zero tolerance, but that's not really restorative practices, so we need to look at that. But that being said, yes, it is. Restorative practices isn't for every incident either, but we use it when it's appropriate, and I've been working with the 4-5 and having those practices happen then too. As a classroom teacher at 3rd grade, I was almost doing restorative practices when I would call a circle together with responsive classrooms. So that's part of it too. And as they go up into the system, through the system, if we have the same practices, developmental design leads into those restorative practices. So it's all about forgiving and knowing when you do something wrong, who does it affect and how to repair. So those are conversations we have all the time. It's not always called restorative practices. So, but it is the way that we're trying to be.
Yeah, that even came up in our discussion towards the end of our session about, violence in schools and, ways to create a different environment and an environment that's more supportive of kids who everybody knows is sort of an outlier, but how can we bring them into the community more? And did we fund? I think we were trying to find funding for that too.
Yeah, there was a $250,000 appropriation to the agency. I think they've chosen to use it in terms of large trainings that multiple districts can attend, as opposed to grants that would go to individual districts. But if you haven't queried them about that, or you, that
Okay, thank you.
Another, just as we're on that kind of element of how we're affecting the whole student, our district has benefited from having one student resource officer. A number of the districts around us have more of a presence for student resource. Our current staffing doesn't have a dedicated student resource officer at our high school. That's a little unusual in Chittenden County, but it's another one of those things do we want to look at that as Health and Human Services? Do we want to, because DARE and other programs are out of that, do we want to look at it as a public safety element, because a lot of the juvenile crimes end up being worked on by those student resource officers? Do we want to look at it as solely as an educational expense? Is it shared among the municipalities? Do only the municipalities that want to invest end up having them? Where do we see that as playing a role in a safe environment? And there is a lot of work on social emotional that happens with a school resource officer. Significant amount. They get to know the community, they get to know parents, and they do a lot of house checks as well. So it's just another element.
So I was thinking we might spend the last few minutes talking about tech ed, but before we start that conversation, are there any board members who want to bring up something that hasn't been discussed. Then maybe I would ask you, Beth, and maybe Patrick, you have something to respond to the conversation about Tech Ed.
Yeah, so I sit on the Regional Advisory Board. I'm this board's representative to cover CT and the Burlington Tech Center. Some of the big focuses that they're working on right now are, as Bob Travers, our excellent director over at CT, says, is they're getting, in many cases, the students who, like Linda mentioned, who, have no other recourse. High school just did not work for them for whatever reason, coming up through the grade levels, and by the time they get to a tech ed program and they're sort of slotting themselves into it, in some cases the statistics are eye-popping. And Bob Travers mentioned that they're seeing kids who aren't even on third grade reading levels by the time they're hitting 11th grade and entering into a tech program. And he's been trying to work and get time and resources devoted into, and I think it was mentioned already, getting down into the lower grades and presenting tech as an option in 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, where they can really properly identify those kids who, maybe they're already deciding in 6th grade that high school is not going to be for them. They're going to think, okay, I'll get to 11th grade and then I'm going to be done. I can drop out at 16. Getting more resources for that, I think, would be something if I can put that into, somebody's mind to focus on. I think that Bob would probably give me a hug the next time that he saw me. Because I know that that's a big focus for him, and it's a big struggle for them, because once they get to those 11th and 12th grade programs, then they've got to cope with this massive range of some individuals who come in to the tech center to take some of our computer design courses, who are absolutely brilliant kids. And they could do well going into, college and then going off to an Ivy League school, but they'll choose our tech programs because it's going to give them the experience that they need to design video games or to model, different structures using the computer programs that they have. And when you have individuals like that who are also taking classes with, someone who is struggling to read at a 4th grade level, there's just this big gap there that the tech centers are really desperately, trying to fill. They're trying to come up with additional resources, additional teachers who can, come in and help these students with such a massive disparity in their learning. I think that's one big thing that Bob has really been focusing on in the meetings that we've been on.
To look at the funding of career tech too, instead of a tuition base, but maybe a percentage of students according to their high school ADM, so it doesn't some people don't want to give up their students, right? So then it's harder at some of the schools to do that. So that would be great. I was watching CBS News, and the woman from IBM, she runs an educational program nationally on IBM. So I emailed her, and I just heard, and I had a conversation on Friday about P-Tech and how to get that up and going in Vermont, and spoke with Bob Travers today. Like, is that a possibility? So it would be working with develop the workforce. It's working with the industries in the area, thinking about skills that are needed. And then it's a 4 to 6 year program for students, which I think is awesome, that they could leave with an applied associate's degree. And then we have Vermont Tech, CBC. I mean, there's so much that we have here that something like that could be put into place. I do like to think about with the tech center and the in our proficiencies, even at high school, why a kid can't graduate in 3 years or 6 years, if that's how long. But the funding is the issue now. So that's definitely, but it's exciting to think about.
I can just add one.
Al Lombardi. been on the board for quite a few years, and I did want to mention a couple of not too well-known things that go on here. One of them is adult education. It's nice to come to a board meeting and not be able to find a parking space outside because there are adults in here they're receiving nationally accredited degrees or certificates for the skill that they needed to upgrade. And it's in a host of a number of areas. So we have hundreds and hundreds of these adults, and coordinating with employers to upgrade those skills. The tech centers are under a lot of pressure. And I think one of the areas where you might be able to help is some money to help the tech centers advertise the various courses that are available to the public. Those are always the scarce dollars that are left as these tech centers are trying to put everything into programs. That seems to be an issue. After 16 years on the board, it was interesting. About a year ago, a co-worker from Williston, after she found out I was on the board and had worked with Brian and a number of other people in upgrading our tech center, she came over and introduced herself, and she says, you know, I'm really grateful for the tech center because my two sons went there. But she says, you know, I want you to know they're not rocket scientists. This is the first thing. And the second thing, both of them have been successful in their careers after attending. They both have their own homes, families, and they've done remarkably well. And I think it says a lot for the excellence and the dedication of our tech centers. I just wanted you to hear that.
Thanks, Mary Beth.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a plug with the tech center discussion for continuing the work to ensure that tech centers are inclusive, welcoming places for girls. They tend to be extremely male centered, and from my days of working at Vermont Works for Women, our focus was always to try to get women, young women, into these career fields that would pay, livable wages that are traditionally male-dominated careers. So just, it's a really big culture shift in those environments, but it's something that I think we continue to need to just pay attention to and work to so that it is a welcoming, inclusive space for girls.
Thanks, Mary Beth. So we have a pretty full agenda, but I would welcome some final comments from legislators or questions if there's something burning that you don't want to leave without asking or saying.
Can you make sure we get these? You email us your topics. Could we have that
I can do
so
that.
We can refer to that
Definitely.
in the session?
Good suggestion.
Thank you.
I'd just like to say thank you for doing this. I think we all appreciate the opportunity to be here and to get into a dialogue. And actually, there's some unfinished business. Nothing big. We don't want to do any of the big stuff. But I think you're hearing a lot of agreement with the perspective that you've presented, and we do appreciate being invited. Thank you.
Yes, thanks.
Well, and on behalf of the board, thank you, because I certainly know how many invitations you're getting and how much time you could spend out of your homes right now. So good luck in the session. Don't hesitate to contact us if education issues come up, and we'll be in touch with you, no doubt, as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Grab a cookie on your way out. Okay, so the next item on our agenda is to get an update from Voices for Education. Thank you.
So I can provide that update.
Thanks, Liz.
We, as we talked last time, we had the summit on December 2nd, and I gave a little bit of an update on that last time. So I guess the big update is that the Nellie Mae Education Fund grant comes to an end on December 31st. So we should all know that. We do have money in the budget for engagement, which is fantastic, that the end of this grant period doesn't leave us high and dry. There are some resources that have been identified by the district, not only the dollars, but also, again, Ben's job description and the change in that has allowed for engagement to be part of his work has been fantastic. So we met last night, our steering committee, to start to theme the data that we got at. Really exciting, and there were about 10 of us working on theming that data last night. It's not ready for prime time yet, but there's some great community action ideas that the group identified and some great individual actions that people are excited about. So we're working on theming that. There are 2 upcoming meetings in January. The dates have not yet been identified, but one is a community gathering, a celebration of the whole grant, and a presentation of the data, just to invite people, community partners, and community members to hear about the project and to hear what came out of it. And the other is more of a targeted community partner meeting that we'll be hosting to all the people that were part of the summit and have been part of the 3-year initiative. Will be brought together to talk about really what excites those organizations and how we can look at the community layout and see what organizations and individuals can take on some of the work that has been identified. And spread it out through community groups and school groups and try to see what we can do to take action. So those are upcoming in January, and I of course will let you know when those meetings are scheduled, and we will keep you posted on that. The only other thing on that is the QID. Kim, do you want to talk about that a little bit? I will say that Kim will talk a little bit about the possibility for moving forward with a group of community members that are working on youth-specific project. The Voices group hasn't decided yet whether and how. There are a lot of questions to see whether that's the direction we're going to take, but it's an opportunity that's exciting to us, because one of our goals 3 years ago was that the community would identify Voices as a resource and a place to look when they wanted to have conversations and wanted to do work that was related. And so that has begun to happen, where we've gotten calls and inquiries from people saying, can Voices, hey, does Voices, can we do? And so it's exciting, and it also requires us to really look at our capacity and our directions and revisit what we came up with at our retreat in the summer, and make sure that moving ahead, we're not just saying, sure, we'll do that. I have a tendency to do that. And that we're really intentional about the way we're moving forward. So we'll keep you posted, and Kim can give a little update on that.
I wasn't able to be there last night, but this Quality Youth Development, which QID that Liz was mentioning, is a trademarked initiative of Essex CHIPS to look at communities, and that being defined as Essex Junction and Westford in our community, as through the lens of sort of a credentialing process that would look at 10 different youth-related benchmarks, not all of them education-related, but throughout our communities, how are we supporting quality youth development? Those 10 benchmarks would, over the course of 9 months, we would look at them and see where we stand. Many of them we're doing some mentoring, we're having a safe place for students to gather at Essex CHIPS. There are probably 6 of them that we can say we're doing pretty well right now. But what would happen, and what the role that Voices for Education might play, we need a sponsoring. If we were to embark on this project to try and look at what is happening comprehensively in supporting youth development across our communities, social, emotional, and otherwise, a lot of it's happening in pockets, and even those of us pretty heavily involved may not realize what's happening through the youth library or perhaps through community justice. Each of us may know pockets, but if we're operating in silos, we're not really looking at the comprehensive support the whole child through their development in a way that they feel they've got voice and agency to affect the community and then to want to return, even as an economic driver. So that is the, I think, longer term objective of these quality youth development credentialing process. It would draw attention to all the services in support of youth. It would, the pieces I'm most excited about is there would be a youth advisory council who would, the local elected boards would seek input from that body. And so that is just one of the 10 benchmarks. But to get this project off the ground, you need a sponsoring nonprofit, essentially, which Voices for Education could be. And from that, they're just responsible then for convening people interested in being on the steering committee, who would then, and that steering committee needs to be 1/3 youth. So it would not necessarily be the same group of people doing Voices for Education, but we would be looking for some representation that would include 1/3 youth that would be willing to steer this particular body of work. And then you would look for the broader community volunteers to say, I'll take this benchmark and be in charge of documenting what we're doing in that category. And you'd have benchmark leaders working with a handful of other people. And the group would come back together. We'd have technical support from the CHIPS director over that period of time, up to 10 hours a month, and be able to get an opinion from the external agency credentialing communities on how we're doing. And I think ideally we would set some sort of standard for how we commit as a broader community to long-term quality youth development. So I think it well aligns with the work that Voices for Education has done in bringing community and education and youth together and elevating voice in that way. So I didn't get to be part of that conversation. I didn't, we had a negotiations meeting, so I didn't make it over there.
Yeah.
So I'm just.
Yeah, so as I said, the group is excited about some of these possibilities. Really what happened was they decided last night that there's so many action ideas that we just generated that if that comes from that, a body of work that feels like it came organically, that maybe we need to put our energies. But we can talk about that in subcommittees and figure out the way. We have a lot of questions and we also have a lot of excitement. So we're going to figure out some of these pieces and bring it back to the board when we have some more clear direction about the way we want to move and recommendations for that.
And I think the piece of that that will be important and somewhat timely is that if Voices for Education wouldn't be the sponsoring group, I think there is some interest in this, and people outside of our bodies that have expressed interest in either participating in the steering committee or leading one of the benchmark groups, but it will still require a sponsoring agency. So if Voices isn't able to do that, and I think we'd want to provide that feedback so that they could be seeking some other agency. Heart and Soul was a consideration, but that's just Essex Junction. And so trying to figure out, we felt as though it was pretty important that so much of this youth development revolves around our education system that I think we felt it pretty important that it would be all three communities.
Okay, questions for Liz or Kim? So we'll stay tuned.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. All right, so now we have our student board reps report. So Laura and Grace.
You go first if you want. Are we standing up? No, I'm just like handing this. So I talked to some students from EMS about personalized learning plans, and a lot of what they said was very similar to what we got from ADL. And I think a big thing for students is having teacher support. And like reasons why we make PLPs is a huge one. I have not heard a legitimate or good reason other than you have to. And in advisory this week, a lot of teachers, especially at the high school, are, you know, pushing their kids to do PLPs. And there are 2 advisories in the room that I'm in. None of the teachers are excited. None of the students are excited. And my computer actually crashed while we were doing it, and my teacher told me to just fake it, just pretend. And so I think that's a huge issue, having, you know, teachers and students who just don't really care about something that could really be beneficial and helpful. I think one of the things that was really big for EMS kids was having such a big chunk of time that was kind of not as supervised as a lot of people would hope for. So having teachers more involved in the process, and even students like understanding why this is important, why they're involved, and having more in-depth questions that really engage students. So that's kind of that. And the things that I'm working on for like community building, and one of the things that Grace and I had talked about was, just to go through the list, was putting gender neutral pronouns in course expectations. So one of the things that I've noticed in all of the course expectations, you know, those papers that you get that your parents have to sign and you have to sign before you take the class, is all of them have like him/her or he/she for students instead of just saying they, which I feel like is a much more inclusive term, because we do have students that are transgender, gender fluid, non-binary, and they're being left out. And I think it's a easy change. It doesn't make too much of a difference, but it includes people. I've been in contact with Mr. Hill, the assistant principal at EHS, to discuss community service opportunities for the whole district. So right now we're working on planning a volunteering opportunity in the spring at the Vermont Youth Conservation Corps. And we have been in contact with one of the directors there, and I have a meeting with Mr. Hill and Mr. Reardon about that later this week. One of the things that I just wanted to mention again that I know we're going to come back to later in the spring is the flipped classroom thing, and I'm hoping to have my Gov teacher, Ms. Davidson, present for that.
I also,
Thanks, Laura.
Oh yeah, yeah, that was awesome, Laura. I also did some stuff with PLPs too. Like kind of like not expected, but when I was at Burlington, like I stumbled upon their newspaper and it had an article like on the front page about PLPs. And just like reading through that, it seems like they're kind of in a similar spot where we are at, and like based on what we've heard from students at ADL and EMS, like everyone's just overall kind of confused about what PLPs are, and what the purpose is. And like I have some quotes in the student report that you can read. And then later, like a few weeks later, I visited Winooski, and I was able to talk to Lindsay Cox, which I think maybe some of you guys might know because she's on like a different school board and she does iLab there. And also I talked to like a French teacher there, and they were just telling me about like how they have implemented PLPs, and there are some good ideas. So I brought them back and I talked to Mr. Rudin about them too. Yeah, and I listed them below. So just like the first one that I said was like a 4-year plan. That's just kind of like, I think would be helpful if students could like maybe plan out their courses, just kind of like a very rough draft of what they would want to take over the 4 years, just so like you can see all the options that are available, and kind of see how like your requirements would work out. Like I know like personally, like I did one and like some of my friends did it, not like with PLPs, and it was like pretty helpful. And also something that at Winooski they did was they like had people fill out like a chart every year, and it like has like different activities. Like they would just like list what they did, and then when they were applying to college or like for scholarships, like it's so easy to just like access that and be like, I did this through all 4 years of high school, because like as someone who just applied to college, like it was so hard filling out the activity section. Yeah, it was so hard to calculate all the hours and everything. And also like the one below is like a why major kind of like activity, or if you're like not going to college, maybe like a why do you want to go into this field sort of thing. Because like when I'm applying to college, like a lot of schools ask why do you want to do this major, and it really requires a lot of thinking. And I think PLPs would help with that, because PLPs are about like thinking what you want to do in the future and reflecting on that. So I think it just would work so well if there was some kind of component for seniors with that. And I think like people would actually appreciate that, because it's something that you can apply to something else that you're doing in life, like on the Common App or something. And then something that Winooski like does really well is they emphasize like close like teacher and student relationships. And I know it's like easier for them because they have like a smaller school population. But I talked to Mr. Rudin, and like we were thinking maybe just having one-on-one meetings between like students and their advisors. I think this would be pretty helpful, like starting from like 10th grade and on, because when you're in STEM, like your teacher teaches STEM, and if you're interested in that field, like you have access to someone who like maybe has gone through what you've gone, like has considered the careers that you've gone through. So I think like that one-on-one meeting would really help, because then students can take what they've like had in their conversation and write about it in their PLPs, or seek out like opportunities for that, like internships or like research or like shadowing. So those are just like the 4 things that I kind of suggested, and then the broad thing that I suggested to Mr. Rudin was just more teacher and student connections, because that kind of is what's going to make PLPs work. It's not Bulb or like a Google portfolio or like some kind of web interface. It's like the human interactions that you have, and then how you like apply that right after. Yeah, and I think like as Laura mentioned, like people are kind of confused and they're not really like optimistic. But I'm hoping that kind of changes in the future, because I think PLPs, there's like a huge potential with that. So that's all I have for PLPs, and I know that was a lot. And so with Student Gov, yeah, I can report on what the committees are doing. So Issues is working on getting varsity sport participation to count for gym credit. So that means if you do like a varsity sport, like indoor track or something, you can get that to count for one of the credits. And we're still like waiting to hear back from Mr. Rudin about like information about how other schools are doing it before we have a meeting with the gym teachers again. Yeah, and also Issues Committee is working on promoting like music and like the arts. So we're going to be doing a lot during what is it called? Fine Arts Night, like that Fine Arts Week, I think. We're going to do a lot with that. And that's something that Jamal has really emphasized, so I'm pretty glad about that, because I play an instrument and I'd love to see more like appreciation for the music and the arts. And then community service, we just made Thanksgiving cards for people in the hospital, and that was just a really nice time for people to just like do something nice. Yeah, and yeah, and bring a smile to people's faces. And then I guess like something that's kind of worth noting that I feel like isn't very talked a lot about, if at all, I guess, outside of Student Gov, is just kind of like the reputation that Student Gov has at school. I would say it's like, I don't know, would you agree, Laura? It's kind of negative at school. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
I mean, if you hear anything about it,
it's always like we don't get anything done, and it's kind of like, I've thought a lot about this. It's kind of like a perpetuating circle, you know, like there was definitely some point where people wanted to do stuff, and then teachers like opposed it, and they didn't, because they had like a stalemate, and then nothing got done. So then people were like, "Oh, Student Gov sucks. We don't do anything," and it kind of just went back around for like a lot of times. Yeah. I think, like, I mean, the cause is definitely just that, like, teachers sometimes just, like, don't really care. And I put, like, a quote from an email that someone wrote. It was just, like, this is futile. Like, why are you doing this? And I think, like, something about that needs to change. And, like, I'm not, like, appealing to the board and saying, like, you guys need to do something. It's just something, like, that you guys should know, I think, because it's important. Because it influences how, like, Student Gov, like, behaves and, like, how we're trying to work hard, but it's kind of hard to do that. Yeah. So, yeah, I think that's all I have to say. So, yeah.
Thanks, Chris. Those were wonderful reports. Thank you. So, questions, comments from board members?
With your advocacy on the varsity sports, I guess the question, why would be just the varsity athletes and not encompassing other athletes? Freshman, JV, because not everyone makes varsity.
Well, like, I'm not in Issues Committee, and I like don't want to like speculate for them, but I think just like for me, I think maybe it was something that the gym teachers brought up, like they only believed that it was varsity sports that should be counted, so it's kind of a compromise. I'm not really sure, and I can ask because I'm
Sure.
going to student gov tomorrow. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks, Grace.
Okay.
That was going to be my question too, Andre.
Oh.
So, because I think if you're doing extra sports, you're getting fit and physically fit just equally. You're probably working just as hard as the person beside you, or above you.
So, Jim, Patrick.
So, I mean, not terribly long ago, but I did go to high school in Vermont, and we did have, if you participated in 2 sports, no matter the level, then it counted towards as a gym credit. So I would also admit, I may not be Chittenden County, but I'm pretty sure that's still in effect. Certainly where I grew up, on the other side of the state, so it certainly wouldn't be without precedent.
That's good. Other comments or questions from Laura and Grace?
I just want to thank you for doing this. This brings a piece of the schools into me because we aren't going out to the schools or in the schools. It helps me make decisions, and it helps me understand better than just hearing a superintendent or a board member talking about something. So I appreciate the reports and I appreciate the work you do, and I thank you.
Kim?
I'm just wondering if you, and I don't want, if you can't speculate, then it's okay too. I just am wondering the inaction, do you feel as though it's either, is it a lack of voice or do you not understand why the action can't be taken? Because sometimes there's probably reasons that liabilities or that administrators might know, and I am sensing some frustration that student gov may try and take up issues, but the ability to move them, I just don't know if you have a sense of whether it's lack of voice or knowing what to do with it or understanding what the outcome and the answer is.
Yeah, I think for varsity sports, I think it's just like opposition from like the gym teachers, so just opposition from a department. And like Mr. Rudin like supports student gov's efforts and we're supposed to meet, but I guess like setting up that meeting takes a long time. So just like sometimes like setting up a meeting takes a while, and then once you receive feedback, it takes time to revise, and then setting up another meeting just takes a long time. And then sometimes it's about like not knowing like who to go to, I think, because like before I was on the student like school board, like I thought school board was like the solution to like every single like school issue, like changing the dress code, making school open campus or something, just like that's all school board, but it's like not, it's like policy versus like administration. And sometimes like people bounce back, and I don't know, it's just like I think the example would be open campus, because I know like Drew and Kayla and I, we met with you, and then you said, oh, that's not really a school board thing, that's kind of a Mr. Rudin thing, and then they went to Mr. Rudin and he's like, no, we kind of want the school's board's approval even though it's not necessary. So it's kind of just like ping-ponging back and forth, and that can kind of lead to like inaction. So I guess that's like lack of communication too, in a way.
That was my other question, just to ask, because it didn't come up under your issues and I didn't know where that had landed. I know the recommendation was that the follow-up be with Mr. Reardon and Beth.
I talked to issues like last week when I was making this, and they didn't bring it up, but I think I will ask again. I think maybe it's just kind of fallen into like a little pit. It needs to be like revived. So yeah.
And thank you very much for sharing perspective. It is helpful to understand how the things that are being implemented are affecting students or how they feel, and it was really cool to hear where something like PLPs seem to be going well, even if on scale Winooski's smaller. It sounds as though they have ideas that could be upscaled or whatever that are working for them, because it seems like they've been effective at it maybe longer than other districts. I don't really know, but thank you for sharing it from a student's lens.
I mean, I think like, because like I talked to them and they were like saying like teachers and students have like the same reactions, so I'm not sure if like more people have implemented it there, but they just have like more ideas that we could like kind of like take from and like implement. So
thank you.
Diane?
From what I know of personal learning plans, Grace, quite frankly, I would think your student government issue here with
the varsity sports and gym class credit, this might be a really good example of why personal learning plans are important.
Yeah.
And how they affect life. So if we really want to get students into the personal learning plans, let's actually work on that one.
I think
That
it's in the
could
proposal
be a really
too.
good example as to how it works and why it's important.
Yeah.
Good luck.
Thanks.
Laura, did you mention some affiliation or contact with Vermont Youth Conservation Corps?
Yes, they haven't been super great at responding. But so that's part of the reason why I'm meeting with Mr. Hill sometime this week, so we can call them and have a more in-depth conversation.
And this is in like a partnership for outward or internships or
Volunteering.
volunteering. I think from my personal experience, I had a son that participated in VYCC for the summer, and he enjoyed it because they were out doing community service, building trails. Their hygiene was once a week bucket days, right? But he really enjoyed it because they're out there as a group, and I think it was a good program. And this is where more community outreach, because they're doing something for communities that they're camping in. And I think that's a very good program.
Thank you.
Good. Any last comments or questions? Thank you both, and I look forward to your next report, and I will give you an opportunity in January to provide feedback to from the questions you got tonight. Okay. All right.
Thanks for that.
Great. Thanks. Okay. Implementation of the student transportation plan status update.
So we sent that ahead of time.
Right.
Could we just take each section with questions around it instead of me reading it?
Yes, please.
Would that be more efficient? So questions about anticipated timeline update. And I'm going to ask Brian to join me in on answering questions if he's had more communication with Jamie than I have.
I guess I have a question that's kind of melded between an item that's in the anticipated timeline update and the action items, which is the question about contingency planning around starting village transportation with less than 6 drivers, in the light of the fact that the driver number seems to be in stasis or perhaps even worse than the last time we received an update. That it seems like we might wait forever if we wait for all 6 drivers, and I was wondering if you could describe the thinking right now around those issues.
Yeah, I think it is the recent loss of another employee and having concerns of the marketplace actually is getting tighter and tighter for CDL drivers. So we're seeing people are, they're considering being lured away by other bonuses or better work hours, or they have learned that this is not their life passion to be doing to and from school transportation. So that has us concerned and taking a look at contingency and also some date of no later than date as well. I mean, as we go through this school year. The continuing pushing or kicking the can down the road seems to, while we're providing us ample time for the administration to plan, principals to work through and build systems and be ready, it also just seems to be hanging there. And at some point, it could start to compete against time to look at a system that was different, configured different with a contingency.
So do you have like a ballpark of what that by X date we'll start doing Y is going to look like, or when we would hear that information?
Yeah, I don't have something to give to you today. I think I share an observation is that we're at a point where it just keeps on getting pushed down, and at some point it's I think we need to look at, if not by some date, then we need to be looking at building a system and communicating what it looks like going forward. So I'm not sure what that is right now.
We literally talked about, is there a date where we just say we can't do it? I mean, we just talked about that yesterday. So when we didn't have
And
further conversation.
I think we're in a good position. I mean, assuming that, you know, the solid work that the committee did to bring forth the next revision of the policy, I mean, I think that the hope was that that policy would continue to guide us even if it wasn't in sort of quote unquote effect. And so it gives us a really good sense of potentially where the board lands and what we value, and we can start to make plans around that. But we know that if we change things, we want to be giving ample notice so that people aren't surprised. I mean, that's also been evident in our conversations, is surprising people with short notice of changes is not the best practice.
Well, thank you for considering things other than waiting for 6 drivers in the circumstances. And just speaking as a Essex Junction resident, I would encourage you to consider putting the buses on the road that you do end up having, just because of so many reasons, but including keeping those drivers associated with our district, making it possible for some people in the village to understand what bus transportation is like, and really taking steps to making it real.
Yeah.
Well, and while we have those drivers, they're not just sitting in limbo, and we have them on buses and getting familiar with bus driving in our district. Not on those routes, but they are working on other buses and riding buses with them and filling in as subs and things. So, but you are correct.
If I could, because I think it's going to come up, and I have a letter that I was asked to read. I'm hesitant to read through all of it, right? But so what I'm going to do is I'm going to email it to the board. It was provided by a parent who couldn't make it to the meeting tonight. But what would be, since we're on an anticipated timeline, if we began implementation even with just one school, we have the drivers right now to do that. I mean, is that correct? Like, say for example, like Hiawatha is just the furthest out right now, you know, for the youngest. Like, if we began that to sort of phase in Essex Junction, I'm just wondering if that would be something that we could really conceivably look at this point, to honestly get the buses on the road, to start to get the community a feel for driving around with buses on the road, you know, how they're going to deal with stops. I think there's a potential real advantage there in knowing that if we're kind of continually, possibly losing, gaining drivers and pushing back the start date with what we have, if it might not be better for us to just get one school down, and then as we get more drivers, get another school in, and then continue on like that, rather than just hanging on to the drivers we have. Keeley mentioned that, keeping them associated with the district, and I wonder if we're to that point now.
So on the driver, everyone's making they're being paid $20 an hour to be bus aides at this point in time, and we're being billed. So they're losing nothing, gaining nothing. It's just that secondly is we spent 2.5 hours talking with the principals, primarily the 2 K3 principals. I think they're in an incredible position to know their school community, to know how we might look at some of these contingencies that could serve the most vulnerable and the youngest. And I really want to make sure that they are playing a primary role in our brainstorming, because I think that they have a great global perspective of that school community. They're probably second to none. So I want to, we did that 2.5 hour kind of deep dive looking at it, talking about how we get the community ready for busing, what that looks like as far as pre-rides, orientations, videos, assemblies, practices, all the way through the 9 yards in that. It's also benefiting us from improving the overall system that we can implement at Essex Elementary and going in, because every year we have a class of kids that are brand new to some of this, as is even kids that move in. So I think that we've got some really good people that can take a look at how might we start to operate if we're not gonna go in and move as a whole? Because there are complexities with regards to, you know, our elementary schools are not geographically based. Also, our families are not limited to one school. And so we want to make sure that as we do this, we would communicate appropriately that, you know, that we're picking up, you know, whether we're going to do an approach almost like a version of special education busing, which is a door-to-door individually assigned kind of transportation, which you'd almost need to do if you were going to do a grade in a school or 2 grades in a school. But it's all on the table right now because we're seeing what is happening with regards to, I mean, we've brought on, this is our 8th driver that we've recruited and brought through a process of anywhere between 5 to 8 weeks of training to be licensed. And it's the 8th time that they've replaced an employee that has left. I want to recognize that, you know, while that's disappointing that we didn't get someplace, it also would have been devastating had we not been recruiting and bringing new people on, because you don't just self-heal 8 employees in that group. So, but we also recognize, in going into FY20's budget, is that there's no time that we'll stop recruiting for bus drivers, aides, custodians, lands crew, and crossing guards and substitutes. Those are right now all issues that pose a challenge, if not a threat, to our system.
Al.
I think Patrick hit the question pretty much. I think there's also a value in starting to phase it, in that we start to gain information on the numbers, what the numbers look like, and from that, as to gradual phase, then you can see maybe we only do need the 5 or a 4. We don't know. So I think with 5 drivers, could you do the K to 5 completely?
For the K to 5?
Yeah. You could?
Yeah.
Okay.
I agree with what's been said so far, and I would ask, is from the survey that was given out to parents, are there parents who express concern about getting their kids to school? If they're incapable of getting their kids to school, the temperature is supposed to, in fact, tonight, drop. Okay, I wouldn't want to see a kid walking at 3 degrees. I'm not thrilled about walking at 3 degrees. So, do we have individuals who are in that situation where, now that we've gotten to single digits, that we have people in jeopardy of not coming to school because it's too cold or too snowy?
That wasn't really in the survey.
That wasn't in the survey?
Yeah, the survey, I was going to say, the survey wasn't really a mechanism. While we understood better who would potentially use it and who would have that early uptake, I think where you're talking about, and I think it's been mentioned before around the table, is that while we don't know, I'm sure there are those families that we have yet to intervene and work with. There are our principals, again, and our guidance counselors and our school workers, you know, work really closely with families, and they know which ones are really in a vulnerable position because they work with them all day. So there are means and mechanisms that have been happening for generations in which try to wrap around, and in some cases it's the community helps the community in that case, while it's not all. So
ways have been found to get kids to school. It's not ideal, but it's happening. Is that fair? Andre.
You also mentioned briefly that the crossing guards are a challenge as well, retention. Is there anything that prohibits engaging students, sort of an internship or community service
to take that could be part of their educational experience. And I'm going to date myself, but I was a crossing guard when I was in elementary, and I'm just wondering what's become of that.
Yeah. Yeah, I found my certificate actually the other day.
Sure.
Okay.
I think we've looked at, there's an element that some of it comes down to timing.
Sure.
And availability, and it is must be on job duty.
Mm-hmm.
And so that if you have volatility where there might be certain mornings somebody's involved in a club or an activity or music or transport to that corner, it can be pretty volatile.
Challenging, sure. Thank you.
Okay. Marla.
Because of the retention of drivers, and we know this is going to be ongoing, is there any initial discussion going on regarding having our own transportation and running it? And is it a possibility it could happen for next year, or is that too soon? And the reason I'm asking is I was talking to someone who came into my work, and he's a school board member, I forgot what district, and he said they don't run into these problems because they have their own buses, their own bus drivers, and they're paid by whatever the union rules are or whatever, and they can retain them. It's not the same as the working for the transportation.
So self-performance is certainly, we looked at it, we continue to look at it. We have currently on staff, we have 11 CDL bus certified drivers, primarily for CTE, but we also have 2 large bus drivers for special ed. So we are currently doing it, so we have some good experience of what that entails. I know from all our surrounding districts, the majority of them are self-performing. Colchester is using our same vendor, but majority of them are self-performing. A majority of them are feeling the pinch that there's injury or retirement or leaving. All of our drivers that work for our contractor right now, their benefit would be that they would potentially, if they had enough hours, would get onto our insurance. Otherwise, their hourly rate would go down, there would be no sign-on bonuses, and the training costs would be borne by them in their professional development. So there is some plus to it, and the benefits has proven out for a lot of our neighbors as one of the ways, but Mountain Transit also pays unemployment while they're not working, because it's only it would be roughly 185 day contract for a bus driver, and they wouldn't be paid in any of those days that they don't work. So there's some trade-offs. The other part is that it's taken us forever, or I guess I should say since about July, so we're 6 months into it. We've been able to generate over 50 leads. Those 50 leads up to now have meant 8 drivers. If we were going out to the marketplace to start on July 1, we would need roughly 24 drivers. So the idea of just like that endeavor, and that's partly what, even when the board put out to bid introducing service to Essex Junction, the one bid that came back referenced the idea of that this just isn't being done right now. To add transportation, that most organizations are working really hard to just continue to maintain it. One more challenge is Act 46 is putting this squarely on the plate, where just like us, transportation becomes a consideration. We have through 46, there's more routes, more demands, and there still continues to be a challenge for drivers. I think self-performance is a way out of this to the extent of other people's history tells me that. The fact that we're all living a new present and a new reality with less than 2% unemployment in our county right now, that this is a job that requires somebody to have a clean driving record, pass a drug test, pass a criminal background test, and then pursue over 85 hours of training and testing. in order to have a split shift where they're working for 22 hours a week. Those are, that's and they're working for someone else. They're our contractor.
Patrick.
The letter that I did receive actually addressed or had questions about some of that point, and actually, I think the impressive thing about it is that it's almost all data driven. Like it's there's not much emotion to it. It's just literally expectations of where they are. As board chair, I wasn't sure what the best way to go about this. Should I just email it?
Well, I think when we open it up for public comment and question, you could, either read the whole thing or pick some.
Yeah, I just procedurally I wasn't sure how to.
Right, pick some pieces that make sense. Any other questions or comments from board members on the update? Okay, then I'll open it up to the audience. Todd?
Sure. I guess I'm at the point where if you believe the adage that actions speak louder than words, it's time for this board and the administration to act. There's been a lot of words that they've amounted to nothing. Here we are, it was back in July or August. We were going to phase in the village starting in October. Now the story's changed to we got to wait till there's all 6. I think the board needs to act. Put a feather in your cap. Start one school. Show that you actually mean what you're saying. It doesn't seem that you really care. I've been following this issue for 2 years. I'm not going to stick around for the policy discussion because what I've learned is what's in the paper, in the policy, what's in the statute doesn't matter. What you're currently doing doesn't comply with the statute or the policy. And what's to say that you're not going to do the same thing next year? You need to show these people that you actually care. You don't seem to care. What it seems like is you are just holding on to these extra drivers so that if someone from the town leaves, you can make the town happy at the expense of the village. Do something. It's not hard. Why are we paying people bus driver wages to be aides? Start a route. Show the community that you've done something. Thank you.
Thanks. Jason, did you?
I was going to comment on the policy.
Great, okay. Patrick, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. I'll send a full copy out to the board. I'll pull this. So I got this sent to me today, and then I was asked to read it. Dear School Board Chair, Vice Chair.
So could you tell us who it's from?
Yes. This is from Jess Wislowski, who is actually a employee of the school district. I'm sharing this letter because I want to request that busing be supplied as soon as possible to the youngest students, aka the car seat population in the junction. Because I work inside the district, I feel vulnerable about sharing opinions in this setting, so I've chosen to use facts and links to share information I hope is helpful in painting a picture of living in an unbused area of the district with a young child. I will say that I'm a person whose child needs busing. I'm a single parent and my job begins early. One opinion I'm willing to share is this, that the neediest in our community could be like me, the least liable to be able to attend a meeting on a Tuesday night and speak in person about it. At a recent board meetings, I heard what sounds like confusion or misunderstanding of the experience of those living in the junction and that sidewalks are not a silver bullet. I would invite board members who are unfamiliar with Junction Elementary School's morning's procedures to come and visit them. My family is currently provided for, and I now benefit from a carpool with another parent of an only child. And additionally, after legal proceedings, my child's transportation burden is now split between 2 parents. But for all the families that are out there that aren't speaking out, I felt it was important to highlight some realities and have cited the sources below. I want to additionally note that when I was on the Health Impact Advisory Committee led by the Department of Health in 2016, back when my child was a toddler, in hopes that work would ensure busing would arrive by the time she was in school. I did not think that I would be entering the ranks of legacy Essex Junction families that had no buses in 2018, my daughter's first year in school. And I realize that there are endless complexities with the task now before the district, but I hope that this additional information is being considered. In this, she cites a number of different facts that she pulled. All of them are referenced, particularly child's primary mode of transportation to school, which cites that Essex Junction parents 70% drive or are driven, while 25% do utilize walking. But that 70% number is the highest amongst all of the legacy districts. She also notes the difficulty of being a single family, and one particular statistic in that in the neighborhoods that surround the school of Essex and Hiawatha, that while over the last 5 years in the United States, single parent families have risen by approximately 3% across the US. In those two districts in Essex Junction, single parent families over 5 years have risen by 173%, and there was another, I think it was 143%. Apologies, I can't find the second number. Oh, sorry, no, 145 and 147%. So just by dint of being in the neighborhoods of where Essex Junction families are currently residing, we have a large number of single parent families who have moved into the communities who simply cannot avail themselves to get their children to school right now. There are further citations and quotes in there, but I think that those are probably some of the most powerful ones. I mean, the 70% drivers and the significant, like 3% to 145% increases in the number of families in Essex Junction who just have only one parent who has to go to work and are left with no options to get their children to school. That's part of what I've certainly been talking about for a while, and I share Brian's frustration with the difficulties in the drivers and how hard it's been to sort of get them on board. But I mean, I do also think that we do need to start phasing in, because I think it's going to provide or alleviate some measure of the population that's out there, that, you know, we do have these people, and I realize that while they are learning very well as bus aides and that they're getting used to those routes, and that's all extremely important. You know, we were shooting for January anyway to begin the services. Like, I don't think that it's necessarily a bad idea to reduce scope, to maybe start with Hiawatha or start with Summit, see how it goes, and just try to close the gap as much as possible. But the letter is sent. There's more facts in it for the board, but I think it's also impactful that it's coming from someone who does work within the district in the central office.
Does anyone want to, Martha?
I have a question. I want to make sure I'm reading the timeline update correctly. If I'm reading this correctly, Brian, we gained another driver, but they gave notice. So we're at net zero. So the drivers or the trainees that are in the process, the 3 that we have, they don't have their license yet. So we can't put them in a bus driving Junction students yet. Is that correct? So there are no extra drivers right now for the Junction. We're waiting for the trainees to finish the process.
We have one driver right now.
One driver, okay. So I just wanted to, you made me start thinking, Todd, I wondered if I misread that. But my understanding is that we're still in that trainee process. So there's just one driver left that already has their license.
Yeah, and we have one driver that has his license but is on medical.
So when you discuss paying people to be aides and $20 an hour, is that also the ones that are in the process?
Yep.
In the training? And then you've got a timeline of current drivers in training. Another timeline, there might be 2 more applicants that seem promising. So if you were paying them $20 an hour, they'd be getting used to the buses by being an aide, but they'd be going through that whole training process. Because I just think that made it sound like we were just sticking them there for the sake of sticking them. They're learning, I think, as they're going through the licensing process.
When will the 5 or 6 5 drivers be fully qualified so that they can drive the buses?
I don't know. I don't, they have to pass. I can give you an estimate based upon if they pass their tests and if they stay with us. So right now it would be the end of January. But I mean, since the last time I updated you, we lost a trainee because he failed his test and just was kind of done. You know, he had invested that many hours in, and it was a mandatory 2-week waiting period to do it again. And you know, while they're making $20 an hour doing this, they're working 20 hours a week, and none of them will be working over the holidays when we have school vacation. So while the bus drivers can go on unemployment, the bus aides we're just hiring them as temporary employees, or it's not even our employee, it's our contractor is hiring them to retain them. But you know, the difficulty would be that sense of not being in control of them passing a test or retaining and staying. And I think, you know, while there's that sense that we've been going since October, there's been a demand of tell us what you know and make it unfeathered and give us that information. And which is fine, except when we're in a dynamic situation, then we say, well, you said one thing and then another thing happened. It becomes difficult to provide, you know, provide information on something that is that's fluid. I mean, we're pretty good at telling you how many teachers we're going to start the school year with, and that we're going to fill in the long-term subs, and we're going to work through that process. But this is a detachment and a reality that I guess I would challenge the fact that it is far from simple, and it's been a process that has been challenging to go in. And I think that, you know, one school, when your schools aren't geographically based, you seem to be that seems to be hard when we start talking about vulnerable, and we start talking about most needed, and we talk about distance to school, and we talk about 3 degrees, that it seems hard to focus on a school population and not a geographical population. And we know that regardless to 3 degrees out or vulnerability or single families, we have made it a policy that we are having walking zones. So there are some people that will never receive transportation. Regardless to the weather, regardless to their household structure or needs. So, you know, there's a bit of it that, you know, in appreciating the complexity and the messages that we send when we solve a problem, you know, we don't have the benefit sometimes of solving a problem for just a group of people. You know, people have an expectation that when we attempt to do something that that there's a reasoning to it, and that it's worked by tapping into the best resources and the most known, and that's our principals and our school communities.
So I heard you saying that you're going to continue to work with the principals. There's no way we could do anything with a single driver, and you'll keep talking about the best way to go forward. Are we ready to move on to the transportation policy? Todd?
I just wanted to follow up that I wasn't able to come to the last meeting where you talked about the implementation plan, and that's where you where the administration unveiled the switch to waiting until you had enough to serve the entire village at one time. And I believe that's what I understood is the last meeting said you're going to wait until there were all 6 so you could serve everybody at one time. I would encourage you to not do that, and as you can add routes to the village, do it. Don't wait till you have a critical mass to serve everybody. Start with, if you have 1 or 2 drivers and you can do a route or 2, do it. my child goes to Summit. If you start with Hiawatha, that's fine, because it's a sign that you're doing something.
Any further reflections? Kim?
I think for me it brings up a question not directly related to transportation but impacting transportation is the capacity and tolerance and interest in looking at geographically realigning our schools. So I would say that that would be something that would be interesting to hear about as we think about longer term problem solving. And I'm guessing there are an equal number of people that would not be happy about that. But I think it's, if what happened in terms of, I think what I understand about who goes to what schools had nothing to do with transportation. So if we're going to begin transporting similar to changing start and stop times, I hope that it will be looked at comprehensively in terms of sustainability.
Right. At the same time, I think if you were going to start transportation based on the policies we've looked at, you could extend the walking zones and talk about transporting based on a bigger walking zone that is currently contemplated, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Keely.
The other reflection based on what Harry said about what we can do with one driver, or if all these 3 trainees become active 4 drivers. Currently, the reality is that we have a up to 3-mile walking radius for students in the village. That's how far it takes to get from the farthest corner of countryside to Hiawatha. That takes like an hour for an adult to walk that distance in 3-degree temperatures.
It's brisk.
And it's regardless of whether you have a sidewalk, because there are some streets in the village that don't have sidewalks. And with one driver driving around the village for an hour, we could theoretically help some people who live more than 2 miles from their school or in grades K through 3. So I think that is something worth thinking about, even if it doesn't transport the whole population of a school. We aren't ever going to transport the whole population of a school if we have walking districts. You're already going to have procedures for letting some kids go to buses and some kids not go to buses.
Yep.
So please do consider that.
Okay. Let's move on to the transportation policy. So, Keely, are you going to talk with us about what's happened?
Brendan, being our fearless leader in the transportation subcommittee, sent his thoughts to the board. Did everyone receive on that email?
Mm-hmm.
With attachments of a revised policy and the beginnings of a draft of related procedures for this policy. So I will be guided by Brendan's email in pointing out what you're looking at here, which isn't up on the board, but
I'm sorry, the policy, right?
So the attachments were on Brendan's email on December 14th.
Yep.
Right. So very few changes have occurred to the policy. The discussion of the board last time that we met and discussed this policy reached its largest sticking point when looking at number 6 under the administrative responsibilities, which had a detail that had been recommended to the committee by Chris Leopold, the legal counsel, that if we wanted to give guidance to transport our most vulnerable students, this would be an appropriate statement to say starting with the youngest, but this seemed to be too much detail to members of the board to put in an administrative responsibility in a policy. So in response to that, the administration suggested removing this. But in order to kind of give us some clarity as to what this planning and procedure would look like, they offered the attached procedures, which if you scroll down to resource planning, this Beth and Brian pointed out to us is in a very early stage of drafting. We're looking at something that is completed by the end of March. And there would be opportunities for board input, though procedures are in the Department of the Administration. There's possibility that things could move around from one tier to another, could become more or less specific, et cetera, to reflect the priorities of the district. So, for instance, if we encountered a situation where it looked like we were going to have a need for 25 drivers and we only had 20 drivers, the administration would be guided by these procedures to say, first we'll look if there's anything that we can do in tier 1 to adjust where we're delivering transportation that can get us to be offering a nearly full system with our 20 drivers. And if there isn't anything in this section that would help, we look at tier 2 offerings, and so on down the line. So that's what this procedure is meant to illustrate, kind of how the administration is going to provide the procedures associated with this policy. Now, because of that editing back in the policy to remove details that people were uncomfortable with in the specific administrative responsibilities, we on the subcommittee came to the conclusion that a lot of the details that had been removed were ones that we're talking about our youngest and most vulnerable students, and that might be more appropriate in the guiding sort of vision and policy section. So we added a statement about that to our discussion of the intended level of service, which will guide the administration as they are developing procedures and implementing bus routes, to understand that it is our intent to be transporting our youngest and most vulnerable students. So I think that covers most of this. There have been some changes to the procedure since we met because it's a draft that is expanding to cover more areas of what the procedures are intended to include. So I don't know if there's any of those that Beth and Brian, you wanted to talk about, sort of what scope to expect, or if we want to stick with mainly focusing on the policy.
I think we should stick to the policy. We just wanted to give, as we gave our admin, as you said, our admin recommendations, we wanted to make it clear to you the tiers that, and start to work through that so you would understand the changes in the policy. So.
And I think it makes more sense to discuss, well, I don't know if we even should discuss the procedures,
I guess before we go on, maybe if Patrick or Al has anything to add that I didn't cover, because I'm not Brendan and I don't have a perfect memory.
That would be good. Just wait,
Yeah.
Patrick
Okay.
or Al first.
Patrick.
No, I think Keely hit the nail on the head. I mean, I think that this was a step towards a compromise in both directions, whereas we removed particularly the K-8 language and replaced it with the particularly our youngest and most vulnerable, that I felt was kind of a give in what I thought was kind of the main separation in our conversations at our last board meeting. It is less specific, but I think it still focuses on what I think the transportation subcommittee as a whole felt was still something we needed to strongly represent in policy, and also to stress legal counsel recommended we place in there. So it's just, it was Chris Leopold who suggested the original K-8 language, and the fact that we have, replaced it now with something a little bit more non-specific and youngest and most vulnerable was kind of where I felt we came together. And then, yeah, Martha, I think you mentioned the procedure, the intent was to show it and, give to the board what it's being worked on now, the spirit of it, where the administration is, without discussion or input from the rest of the board, because that's not where we should go.
Exactly.
Right, this has been a lot of work. There have been a lot of discussions, and a lot of thought has gone into this. There are a couple of things, just FYI. When I looked at tiers, there was a lot of things that could happen, not only for this board, but for future boards. And I think a better word for the tier is category. In that, for example, let's say there's a change in the students that are coming from Grand Isle, or there are other things, intercurricular might not be required for Essex Town, or whatever. We can't predict all those things. Those are categories that could free up capacity at any time for us or future boards. And so when I looked at
I'm going to interrupt you because I don't want us to be talking about the procedure. If you don't mind, I really want us to focus on policy. The procedure is not our work.
Well, that's what I said.
Right.
Oh, 3 meetings ago. But since that time, my point was everything needs to be on the table.
In the procedure.
In the procedure.
Okay.
And the board should have an opportunity to review the procedure. And I think the target date for that was March 31st.
Yeah.
Very good.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, questions on the policy? Mark.
My question, I emailed you, I apologize, it was late in the morning. But for me to vote on this policy, I need to know how this policy that we're going to vote on is so different from the other policy. I need to know if the scenario of this last August happened, how that same scenario is going to work here before I vote on this. So I know you don't want to talk procedures, but we had discussed at the last meeting, I thought that we needed to see some of the procedures to understand some of our thought processes and where we're thinking. And the only thing I'll say to Al talking about procedures and tiers, when I saw tiers, I thought of what you discussed with the legislatures. But I can't make a decision on this policy until I know how it's totally different than the other policy. Would we still be at this point today with no transportation in the junction if this policy was in effect last July?
Keely, I know you have worked really carefully on this, and you clearly understood that the policy that we have now really didn't focus the district anywhere. Can you respond to Marla's question?
My feeling about the difference in this policy is that, among other things, it is pretty specific about what attached procedures should exist, so that everyone can be informed, especially on the board, but also in the community, about what's going on. And if we scroll down in the policy to the administrative responsibilities, among them is determining projected bus ridership for portions of the district outside the walking zone for each school. So that means that last summer, if this policy were in effect, we would have already done the Essex Junction survey, which it was intended to have been done like last June, whenever all of the surveys were intended to be done, but now it's in the policy that you have to understand who's planning to ride the buses from every school. This would help the administration to understand how many people would be impacted at each and every school. Even when we had specific language about starting with the youngest students starting from kindergarten in item number 6, the specifics of details like walking zones and length of time spent on a bus were still in the control of the administration. I think it would be ideal to get some maximums on those put into the tiers so that we know, like, if we're at the point where students are spending 2 hours on a bus, we need to just give up on some, like, students who live really close or some older students or something. So I'd like to see that when we're giving feedback, but putting specific details in the policy didn't seem like a good idea. A lot of our neighboring districts do have, like, students won't walk more than a mile to a bus stop or that kind of thing, but there was a lot of discussion about how that would impact the Westford contract. And so it was the feeling of the committee working with the administration that the fewer, like, numeric specifics, the better. So I think there's still a lot of sliders and adjusters that the administration can work with, and that by asking them to have specific procedures and bring specific information to the board before the start of the school year, we'll be able to give feedback like, oh, you think that a 3-mile walking zone is appropriate? Like, we don't feel that that works in the winter. Or, like, I see that, you know, you've decided not to transport high school students. Like, why is that the decision based on these, this policy? And I think that being guided by the initial language about our intended service, that's something that the administration has been asking for. And by putting youngest and most vulnerable students in there, I don't think that you would have a situation where no transportation is being provided to any kindergartners from a school, if that's really our priorities.
So Keely, under the policy where it says develop procedures, identifying and prioritizing. So we're being told that administration is going to bring procedures to us by March 31st. We're going to have procedures to look at.
To look at, yes.
To look at. So I'm being expected to vote on this tonight without seeing administration's total intent. And also under develop procedures, what date every year do those procedures have to be brought to the board to be discussed? That's what this policy makes it sound like. Develop procedures identifying and prioritizing how services may be modified. So it's in policy, but it comes back. We're back through this whole situation. So what date does the superintendent bring us the procedures? Is it yearly we're going to be looking at procedures?
I mean, procedures would generally remain through the policy review process unless there was a necessity to make a change to them. I believe that the administration adjusts procedures outside of the policy review process when, like, there's a change in the law. But otherwise it would be up to somebody to, like.
But the boards don't approve the procedures.
No.
So,
But as discussed at the meeting with Nicole Mace, we can review them and I guess give feedback.
I'm sorry, I don't have a lot of trust at this point. I have lost a lot of trust, and I don't feel comfortable voting on a policy that I'm not sure exactly how it plays out as to how this current year has progressed. And I know, Keely, you think that this is going to work, but I would think that you could go back and look at it and say, okay, we had X amount of drivers. We now know we have X amount of students in the junction outside the walking zones. I would just like to see how this policy makes that work before I vote on it.
I mean, I would love to see a lot of things about scenario planning as well. I haven't gotten to go and, like, mess around with that website about the transportation software yet, but I I mean, we don't actually know how many people that we're gonna be riding buses in the junction. Cause like a survey went out by email, I don't think it went out in the Friday folders. We'll see who's interested when they start running the buses.
Yeah.
A lot of people in the junction don't actually believe that busing is gonna happen this year. A lot of people have after-school care set up for their students because they've had to during the course of the year, and their plans might change for next year if we like actually have the buses in place over the summer. So any official numbers are gonna be a guess. And we in the committee were just trying to work in good faith in the policy development process, which I think the four of us were pretty confident at our last meeting that we had done the best that we can do to get a policy that makes some more clarity.
So, Marla, I'm going to kind of turn it back to you. Can you tell me how you could envision a transportation system that would meet this policy statement that says transportation will be furnished to and from school and public roads to students, particularly our youngest and most vulnerable, who do not reside within the designated walking zones? Can you tell me how you could envision, and I hate talking about individual communities, but how could you envision that the district could not transport students from Essex Junction and meet this policy statement?
I have no clue how it's going to work, because I don't know what you mean by the youngest and most vulnerable. I haven't seen it in operation. The town of Essex and Westford get total transportation. How do you think it's going to work in Westford if that youngest and most vulnerable happens? How's it going to work for your district? I think we need to see how it's going to work.
For me, I read it to me that if there aren't sufficient drivers, our high school students could be in jeopardy of losing transportation. That's how I read it.
I know we don't want to go back to procedures, but the need for definitions will be addressed in the procedural document. And I think that's a fair thing. The only one concern I've had is that everything needs to be on the table for the administration. You need to take a scan of everything and make those decisions. That's the only concern I've had.
Well, and we think this does that, right?
The policy is, as it stands, I believe it's the right thing to do. But saying that, without the policy, I think you'll have an opportunity to get into that at that time. And I think there are key words in this policy that need to be defined in the procedure. Or if you need those words defined here, define them here. But I think it's okay. I feel comfortable that it's the right thing to do. It's fair and balanced.
You touched upon that we might end up having to forego high school transport in order to meet the youngest and most vulnerable. But my concern is, if we were to do that, prioritization of what high school transport would need to be discussed, because do we eliminate an island bus knowing that we're going to lose revenue potentially versus providing our own students high school transport.
So you're talking about procedures again.
I understand, but
I really want to move us away from that tonight. There will be a time to comment on that
Sure.
when the procedures come to us.
could I ask if we could allow the gentleman to speak forward in deference?
Once the board is finished. Kim, sorry.
No, I understand.
I'm not, and I apologize if I'm missing it. One, there's a typo in number 5. I think it probably just were words that were left in there that weren't intentionally left in there. And the first
It was
sentence,
the same ones from the first reading that everybody keeps saying is going to be
bus schedules
corrected.
indicated time and designated bus routes for the entire district. It says will be annually. I think the will be just needs.
We asked for that to be removed before, and I didn't check that it actually was removed. So.
Okay, all right, so I caught a typo you didn't, oh my gosh. I think the other piece, and maybe I'm just not seeing it, that would be helpful to have referenced somewhere is the data-driven decision-making. So, you know, envisioning a time where we're a few years down the road, not just implementing in any one community, but we're a few years down the road and we have comprehensive data like we might in established communities. I just don't know whether that's something that shows up here or can be, my expectation would be if you're bringing forward a change in plans, you're doing it with data.
I can actually speak to our discussion on that point. Brendan had proposed referencing that in an edit to number 6 in our last discussion of this with the full board. The reason why we didn't proceed with it is because we had initially made a request, well, in the initial draft, before it came to the full board, when discussing the factors for establishing routes and stops in number 4, we had made reference to informed by data, because a lot of those things like density and speed of traffic, like obviously data exists on that. But I don't know if it was the administration or Chris Leopold, but that was removed, not by the committee, but it was removed from the administration and legal version. So I don't know if it's something that legal counsel recommended we not put in there, but we weren't gonna put it back in after it had been taken out.
Yeah.
But it could be referenced in the procedure, I presume?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would imagine.
That
I
makes
guess
sense.
that's what I would envision as you're considering the tiers or anything else, really, that it'll be informed by data.
So we could ask the administration to consider that. Other questions or comments from board members? Diane?
I think the committee did an excellent job of compromising, given avid discussion we had last time. I think they have merged our comments with legal to the best of their ability. And it's nice to see the procedure outline. I would add consideration of walking school buses for, it gets fleshed out since those are already a part of the practice that we have.
What did you just
Walking
say?
School bus. You familiar with the walking school bus?
No.
I'll talk to you about walking school buses later.
I gotcha. Okay. Just wasn't familiar with the term.
It's, I don't know if they do it at Hiawatha, but at Summit.
Walk to school day.
Yeah.
It's members of the school staff along with usually some volunteer athletes from Essex High School.
I know.
Shepherding.
I understand.
Okay.
I've seen the
Okay.
posts about that. I just wasn't familiar with the term.
So in response to, could this policy be used with the August situation? And I think indeed it could. Because I think at that point in time, we'd also have fleshed out procedures which we are not seeing, but we are seeing an outline. And I think the outline would provide, at this point, provides me the idea of where the administration is going and where things will be fleshed out. So, no policy is perfect, but I think this is an excellent compromise for our very past discussions. I congratulate the committee for a job well done.
Thanks, Diane. Any other questions or comments from board members? Patrick and
And I think I do want to address Marla's point as well about, you know, what would our situation in the fall have looked like with, you know, this particular policy in place. I think that it does do what, you know, the board should be doing, at least insofar as that the administration would have come to us with a plan. And if it was the plan that's in place now, then we would have said, how is this, how is this impacting, you know, our youngest and most vulnerable? Like, clearly serving a legacy district does not help the youngest throughout the district. I did have concerns about whether or not, you know, walking zones, if they were to expand out 3 miles, would cover all of Essex Junction. But if that was the case with this policy, they'd have to expand out everywhere across the districts, because there's nothing in here about legacy districts getting anything in particular. So if that happened in Essex Junction, then it would be happening in Essex Town, it would be happening in Westford, and there would be a tiny sliver of every single town that would only be able to get busing at that point. I mean, I don't think it's perfect. You know, I much like Diane said, you know, I would prefer stronger language in the policy, you know, a little bit more detail, a little bit more teeth. But do I think that this is going to get us to the point where if we're brought a procedure that doesn't look like it's equitable, does this policy allow us to say, this doesn't work, like go back, revise, and bring us something else? I think it does. I mean, that may just be me personally, but that's kind of where I got to as far as a compromise standpoint on this. I don't know if that helps make your decision or not, but when I was thinking about it and going through it, that's what I was expecting. I'm like, does this help everyone universally, and does it eliminate the old legacy districts get stuff? Like, I think that this policy does that. I think that it is pretty equitable across the district, and it helps us cover those, you know, poor kindergartners who are trying to toddle their way to school at -3 degrees.
Is it possible to add a piece to it that the board would be reviewing? Not only a policy, because boards aren't supposed to be doing the procedures, but the boards do review policies. I think it would be great if the board looked at this annually also, or at least every 2 years. I think there should be a time period in this as to when it's reviewed, to ensure that this is working for all the districts in the future years.
So you're suggesting a different timeline for review. Don't you think if there were issues that the board would be asking for an early review? That's certainly what I think would happen with any policy that wasn't working for the district.
The board would just decide to go ahead and review it?
Exactly. Kim?
I would see it differently than a policy review schedule. Having policies and not monitoring them doesn't make sense. So I would imagine we would have, as part of a budget discussion or a spring discussion or whenever is timely and makes sense, a monitoring of our transportation policy, our class size policy, like all things that impact budget decisions we make. But we create these policies and they exist. And having evidence as to our compliance with these policies is our job. So I think that that would be a schedule that I would hope that we'll commit to, and that administration would understand how that fits in the process of other decision making that is in our purview, and that hopefully our language isn't such that it is so we just need evidence that what you're doing is complying with the intent of policy, and if we are interpreting the policy differently, we might need to fix the language, but it wouldn't.
Right.
I can't imagine that we would want to approve a policy that we think the policy language needs to be reviewed every year. That seems like that's a problem.
Right. So depending on what we decide about governance, if we stick with the kind of governance we're using now, we definitely have to come up with a way to monitor policies.
Wouldn't we?
I mean,
I just think in any mode of governance,
right.
we're responsible
Well,
for
that's
crafting
kind of-
policy,
that's kind of-
monitoring compliance with policy, and
Right.
reporting on student outcomes.
So I'm just saying
Okay.
it happens more naturally perhaps than policy governance. But if we don't go to policy governance, we have to be sure we make it a priority. That's all I was saying. Okay, Keely. Sorry, Jason.
No
I
worries.
can't.
No
I
worries.
can't control who raises their hand.
Just to speak to that, from both Marla and Ken, if you look at the very end of the administrative responsibilities, the law requires number 8, which is basic information about the transportation system in our district's annual report. But we, as a committee, found it very important to retain throughout this policy development process what we added in number 9, which is more in-depth, data-driven look at our transportation system, and I think that conversation will bring up any differences of perception about how the policy and the procedures are working and informing transportation, so that if need be, we can do this process again.
Yes, Kelly, that's a helpful point. Does that help you? If we're going to have an annual report on the performance.
That's what we mean by an annual report.
Yeah.
I mean, every year we have Amy Cole in here telling us about student outcomes, and
right.
We do that for a lot of things, and this is asking for the same thing about transportation.
Right. Other board member comments or questions? Can we finally get to Jason? Jason.
Great. Well, thank you. First, I appreciate all the work being done on the policy for transportation. I think it's very important. What concerns me the most when I look at it is I never see any words about treating all the students as equal, all the schools as equal. There's something about walking zones by school, which could imply that the walking zones for the different schools will be different. And as we're trying to have one district of all the students together, not having strong language in there that says, at least by a grade level, that we're going to treat all the schools equal, I think is a big miss to not be in there, because it can leave open for interpretation later of folks setting school zones in the or walking zones differently by school. I also really would urge that not having definition of what youngest and most vulnerable needs in the policy is, once again, you're leaving something very open to interpretation. And the fact that all of this is going to be set into a procedure that is run by the administration, the school board presents the policy, not having these things spelled out as part of the policy, this is what we're saying is youngest and most vulnerable, the definition of that, and also the definition, like I said, of the walking, making sure that all of the students in the district are treated equal. I think that will come to a long way of satisfying the disparity that the Essex Junction families feel, and keeping Essex Westford, Essex Junction as an equal community. It's definitely a challenge. I mean, 3 miles here, Hiawatha, that's like my neighbors walk there. We luckily only have to walk the Summit, which is for a kindergartner and a 3rd grader. It takes them about an hour. So that's leaving at 6:45 and maybe makes it to school in 7:45 if it's not a bad weather day. I would say I'd have to give them a flashlight if they left tomorrow to get to school, and I think that's, you know, that's across the board. We don't want that with our youngest population. As you get older, maybe we have more trust in those kids, but young kids trying to walk for an hour and a half is, you know, the next shiny thing. I know my children would tend to get pretty distracted walking that long to school, and the safety concern of it. So as we go, serving the young first until we get to the older ones, it may inconvenience the whole district if we don't have enough bus drivers. Everybody might have to have parents that drive certain populations of kids to school or bus or carpool, but we'll be serving the community equally. And I really urge the board to make sure the language in our policy stresses that we're going to serve our community equally because we want to be one community. So thank you. Thanks for all the work, but
Thanks.
thank you.
Do you want to respond, or do you want to comment on why we can't ever serve equally?
Well, I more had a response on wording that I know Al and Jason have both brought up definitions there. I think youngest is pretty clear, but if people want to discuss vulnerable, we can discuss that. But I think under administrative responsibilities, number 1 is what Jason's referring to about walking zones. And I can see his point. We were thinking of it in terms of like a map. There's a walking zone for each school. But you could say essentially the same thing in a way that would eliminate that problem by saying establish walking zones to school for each grade level.
The problem is that you can't have a walking zone when there aren't sidewalks.
That's what subject to safe travel conditions covers in that item.
Right.
So I'm not changing anything about the intent of this item by saying publish walking zones to school for each grade level, when the subject to safe travel conditions covers the issue of sidewalks and traffic.
Yeah, just, I understand, and I completely stay with the intent with the grade level difference between and I don't think we'd run into it, but we just don't have the same grade configurations in all our buildings.
Right, but you could interpret for each grade level however you want. But it would mean, for instance, that people at the vaguely same grade level are seeing vaguely similar.
Yeah, and that you've seen, the board's seen the matrix of walking zones by grade level, so we're completely.
But the way that it's worded right now implies that you are looking at each school separately, which wasn't the intent when we were developing this.
Yeah, I agree.
So what are you suggesting?
I'm suggesting change to establish, because the publish was thinking about like putting those maps out somewhere.
Yeah.
Establish walking zones to school for each grade level. And then the remainder would remain the same, designating a distance that students will be expected to walk subject to safe travel conditions.
Number 1, admin.
Where are you on that?
This is number 1 under administrative responsibilities. Walking zones to school for each grade level.
Do you think that's workable?
I do, because of the safe travel conditions.
Word that again, establish walking zones.
Establish
Yeah.
walking zones to school for each grade level.
Kim, do you have that? Okay. Kim. Yes, Kim.
Again, I'm just thinking about Brian's comment on the grade configuration, and what does that mean for like a Westford K-8?
We don't have any. We don't have any place.
Sidewalks.
We have no sidewalks.
And the K2 configuration. Wait, am I getting it wrong? K2 and then 3-5, and K3s I'm just trying to figure where those spaces could come into conflict with each other by calling it grades.
Yeah, it hasn't to date, and I think if it does in the future for some completely unforeseeable reason, that we could come back and talk about it, but we've done a K-8, a K-5, 6-8, 9-12, radius, walking distance to school, walking distance to stop, duration.
We were trying to describe that practice.
Yep.
Not to describe a practice of drawing a separate line for each school.
Yeah.
So I hear you saying you think it's workable. And board members like it. Anything that helps us feel like one district is helpful.
Does that help
Yeah,
address that particular item?
I do think that helps. I mean, even if you used his language of treat it as K-5, 6-8, 9-12, you kind of get the same intent too. That helps you be more clear with your school's differences between K2 and K3.
Catch that. I think we're okay.
Yeah.
Are we ready to vote, Al?
And one of the changes that we put in was particularly our youngest and most vulnerable students. Without the definition, I really think that what is there, public roads, 2 students who do not reside, period. I don't think the particular youngest and most vulnerable is necessary. It's taken care of in the walking zones. Because vulnerable could mean any number of things. Handicaps, age, maturity. And without that definition.
So the definition is, there's a draft definition in the procedure.
But I couldn't talk about it.
I know, but let me say it this way, is it reasonable to define vulnerable in the procedure? That way, if we change our mind, it's easier to change.
That was my suggestion, and there was a commitment in the meeting that would be done. And I'm comfortable with that.
Okay.
I think the question comes up if there is a concern or a lawsuit, is it adequate since it's not in the policy, but it's in the procedure? And I don't know. You think it is? Okay.
I do. Do we need to postpone this discussion? We still have a bunch of agenda items. It's at 9:30. Can we get through this tonight, or do we need to keep talking?
Changes to this, I'm not really sure, because we've got one typo in 5 that needs to be corrected. We have one typo or change in 1. Have we significantly changed this? Because this is a significant change from the previous first reading. And I know that in first readings, yes, some corrections are made, but now we're making more corrections in second reading. Is it common practice to make these many corrections and still have a second, as this is second reading?
It's fine,
okay.
yeah.
No,
We've only done 2 things.
Yeah.
We took 2 words out of one sentence, and yeah, I think absolutely. Okay, Kim.
There are some policies like bullying, hazing, and harassment that have definition within the policy, just it comes above administrative procedure or something like that.
Yes, you definitely can.
I just didn't know if we've got only one definition. I don't know if that makes sense to put it in. If there are other things that need definition, there are samples in some of our policies where definition shows up in there.
We could add
I'm somewhat
definition
indifferent.
to
I'm
the
just
policy.
saying, like, it can be that way.
The feeling of the committee on this matter was that there were a lot of words in any policy that can get defined, like school. Like we've seen transportation policies where like they define school, and like we could see defining public roads, and we wanted to actually complete the work of the committee. Brendan was not enthusiastic about developing a list of all the words that could possibly be defined, but we were all comfortable with the suggestion, like with Al, of putting certain keywords defined in procedure.
I'm indifferent. I just was pointing out we have precedent for having done it. So.
Anything else? Are we ready for a motion?
Would you reword the areas that have been changed again for me?
Here's the number 1, under administrative responsibility, the superintendent or designee will, 1, establish walking zones to schools for each grade level.
To schools, okay.
To school.
To schools, right?
To school.
School, singular.
To school for each grade level. And then under number 5, the edit has been made so that the first sentence reads, prepare bus schedules indicating time and designated bus route for the entire district annually and provide them to
the
families in August.
So the words will be have been taken out. Okay.
So those were the 2 changes.
Kayla, you want to make a motion?
I've never actually made a motion.
Right. How appropriate.
I move that we approve this policy on second reading.
Yes, we should say
policy
C3, transportation. Second. Okay. Is there further discussion? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed say nay. Huge thanks to the Transportation Subcommittee. This has been quite a journey, and I really appreciate the work you have done. I've thanked Brendan a couple of times. I'll probably thank him again. Okay, thanks, Jason.
Good night, Jason.
Good.
Santa.
I'm not able to get to my email for some reason. So if you could pull the agenda up, that would be helpful. Okay, so budget.
Yes. Attached to your notes was the December 1st letter that's a statutory requirement of the Commissioner of Taxes to publish. It sets the yield and a few other key numbers. It also has become sort of an annual opportunity to start to see where the administration may be coming in. So that letter went out. What we see is that they are projecting growth in educational spending to be 3.24. I know how that number came up. It was through a very cursory survey that the AOE performed of some business managers that happened to be in a room on that day. So you're looking at exclusively town meeting budgets, and you're looking at exclusively budgets that were able to be near completion at that point in time. So there are a considerable number of budgets that are still going. The other key point to remember is that the AOE is behind in distributing information. We're still waiting on allowable tuition for last year. We're still waiting on equalized pupils for pre, tech, and regular.
Which was due December 15?
Yep. Yeah. So, you know, when we start talking about a 3.24, understand it's an early number, but I think what's telling in the letter is that it starts to suppose that if school boards can do the great work they did last year, and that was turn back what looked like it could be a significant increase in educational spending and come in only at 1.7%, then great things could happen and more money could be freed up. So I'm here to tell you that 1.7% as far as a cap or a target would have significant impacts on your programming. And it would be at the cost of staff. Where right now we know that our salary and benefits, our health insurance alone is going up 11.8%. So that adds nearly, just puts about $1 million onto the bottom of your budget. We also know that we're in negotiations, so that we're working through that. So we don't have givens as far as what all our staff costs will be, and that most likely will be the case as we go through budget development. So, I think the key moment here is to have a bit of a conversation, plug in, have the board discuss among themselves whether they want to establish a target. And I know that there's always reluctance to doing so. Myself, as a person that works with you in this financial planning, is we need to know now so that we have a month to really work through with your leadership team and your principals, rather than getting in and sort of seeing where we might end up and then finding out in budget sessions that we just can't go to the voters with either a 3.24 or a 4%, because that's also another number they talk about, is the educational spending on a per pupil basis is estimated to go up 4.1%. So I guess it's the gut check moment. We typically would say we want to have high quality education and programming for all our students. We want to be sensitive to our taxpayers. And in CTE, sometimes we say, and sensitive to our sending districts in trying to maintain a reasonable tuition. That's great, and we can run with that, and we're good at doing that. It's just that we just need to know whether we're going to pivot at all, and whether we're going to chase a number, or what we do if a number starts to come out as a primary target to school boards. So.
Thoughts? Patrick and then Lachlan.
Could you roughly, super roughly ballpark, when you say a reduction in, the level of, the services that we provide our children by, whether it be staff elimination or what have you, what would we be looking at? Like laying off a dozen teachers, 24, laying off custodial staff? I guess I kind of want to put a face on what that would mean.
As we go in, I can do some of the numbers. It's, you're talking, it would be it would be millions of dollars.
So
So it's $100,000. Roughly, it's $100,000 per teacher with salary and benefits. So if you just use that math, you're looking at 10 teachers for every $1 million that you're trying to manage.
Okay. Yeah, that's what I was like. I'm not going to hold you to anything a month from now. I would just.
You're benefited from an expert here. Is like, do we focus at all on gross increase? Do we focus on educational spending? Do we focus on tax rate? Do we focus on, local spending versus, mandates and so forth? So those are all different targets that the board can sort of take a look at and say, well, our community expects this, or our community values this.
I think administration has proved that they have brought us excellent budgets, with us saying, bring us however it's worded. I don't like to put a number on something because, and I'm reading Beth's superintendent report, there's lots of things the educational leadership team is doing, and I think it takes away some of the creativity of the shifting and the moving of resources that they're doing. I thought we had an excellent budget season last year. I thought administration brought it in, and I just dread saying increase the budget by 3% or decrease it by. I have never liked that. I don't think it suits the needs of the students.
Other comments?
number of the new initiatives that I believe the administration would like to implement. It seems to me that student intervention, and by having specialists in place to do those interventions to help students, would cost more money. And I don't, and I think a number of those interventions are needed and necessary. Now, having said that, I have no idea of what you're looking at in terms of how Alpine intervention process would look like, how much time would be devoted, and what that would cost, above and beyond our normal budget.
I think some of the things that we can do with intervention is really looking at schedules, not so much a cost, but how we use the interventionist and the time that we have. So part of our measurable outcome is to have third graders reading on grade level by the end of the year, right? So when we think about that, what are the costs? Do we need to shift interventions so we give them to the lower grades? Those are the conversations that we're having with the leadership team. So we really need to think about what we have with intervention and how do we shift it without a cost. I don't see a cost to the intervention at the moment.
I see the K-3 as an investment.
Absolutely.
And
absolutely.
And I think it would take more resource. That's why I'm trying to get an idea of us, not specific, but a ballpark figure.
Yeah. Well, and the work that we're doing with the professional learning communities, especially K through 3, is they're all focused on reading. That's where the meat of the work and the improvements with students, all students, will come from. And our real focus, all the principals are focused on that.
But it's okay.
We need to make sure they're getting double dipped in reading. Is every child that's struggling in reading getting intervention and from their teacher, classroom teacher?
Is that all grades?
It should be all grades, yes.
But in this budget cycle, I'm just looking for that number.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I guess I'm in charge. Briefly, go Diane.
Well, what I would like to see is food service being made a department and not an enterprise fund. I'm not sure how that would impact the bottom line, but I guess I'd like to see a level programming budget as to keeping our programs where they are. I don't know what that number is, but I don't want to whack at our kids after we're making the progress we're making. I'd like to see more progress. So if the tax budget again, you'll give me that number and we can decide if that's palatable for the communities or not. But I'd rather give the kids the best shot.
So, do you want to say level programming, or do you want to say the best programming to meet the district's goals?
The latter.
Yeah. I don't know who's first.
I would like for us to use language that would show up on our ballots. So per pupil spending, that shows up beneath our.
It's education spending per equalized
pupil. So that I think should be our increase-decrease number. Not that we shouldn't be showing our gross increase or decrease, but that is our relevant number, and it's going to be on the ballot. So I'd like for that to be the frame through which we look at our numbers at each turn. And that is the sort of focus of our conversation as well. And I am not a fan ever of chasing numbers, so I would prefer to see what a budget looks like that aligns with progress towards our vision. And I'd like that to be the language and the lens that we use as we explore each of the budget categories in larger chunks versus single line items. Those would be my wish list items, and that we not lose sight of increases outside of our control, like healthcare, so that that remains part of our conversation. And so I think, I've never been a fan of that. It's kept here. I think that there are ways for us to explain what's necessary to do what we need to do for kids while we are being as fiscally responsible as we can. So that would be my commentary.
Patrick?
I agree with Kim, with Diane, but I feel I would be doing a disservice to not mention at least that as far as, community goodwill, we may be kind of at a lower point than we have been in previous years. The mistakes that we made or the things that were out of our control, they kind of snowballed. So if we present a budget, no matter how we word it, with, equalized, pupil or however we put on there, ultimately people are going to look at that big number. And if that big number increases a lot and we're potentially in a situation where, we don't have the goodwill in the community that we maybe have enjoyed the last couple of years, Brian, you had mentioned, should we be prepared to pivot? I think that it would probably be a good idea for us to create the budget initially, as Kim and as Diane are mentioning. But I think that it might not be a bad idea that if we get that and we look at it and we're kind of like, whoa, sticker shock, that we may want to. I do think that it would be a good idea for us to have a backup plan. I'd be uncomfortable without having one, and getting too deep into budget season, knowing that, we are where we are.
We talked about that yesterday too.
And our board always did it by saying, what are your priorities?
And I think if Brendan was here, he would mention that promise of merger and making sure that we're showing that at budget time, and he would remind us, I know he would remind us that we're going to be showing we're going to be losing like a 2 cent on the tax rate, so we're battling that also.
Right.
So Brendan, you're not here, but I think I remember what he said. I think he said that last year.
Marvelous, Tim, Brendan. Any other comments about budget? Keely?
Just that I agree with what everyone said about focusing on continuing to offer programs that focus on kids and not focusing on numbers that are arbitrarily thrown at us from the state. But looking at this letter, it was envisioning 1.7% for overall education spending growth in the state, but a 2.5% per pupil spending growth. So I think that means that they're trying to ask the districts that are losing the pupils to cut more aggressively than districts like ours where the pupil count is holding more steady. Or I think our kindergarten class is anticipated to be growing again, at least what I remember of the demographics a few years ago. My kids are at like the bottom of the well.
Yep.
So it's not 1.7% per pupil if we're talking about.
I think there is also the ratio study committee, I think, is coming out with some guidance that isn't prescribing ratios, but it's better defining what is to be included or not included to get consistent numbers. So I would want our budget discussions to have looked at that information. I don't know that we'll necessarily be hearing what that target has to be, or we're told to be. We weren't in danger of not being there last time. So I think it just needs to be part of the discussion, so we've done our due diligence in looking at that information.
Yeah.
And we will hear about it because that study group is done or wrapping up.
Good point. Anything else? Brian, do you feel I know we didn't give you exactly what you asked for.
Well, I mean, sometimes not getting something is a clear message, so I mean, it's what to work with.
Great, thanks. Okay, on the superintendent's report, we decided, since this agenda was full, that we would just ask if board members had questions on what Beth sent us. So, are there questions? Thank you. I'll just say quickly, I appreciated all the information about evaluation systems for administrators and teachers. I think that's something boards always struggle to have a sense of what's going on, so I appreciated that.
What I didn't write in here, which is just a funny thing, the standards that we're looking at, that this task team is looking at for administrators, we had quite a few different sets. One that came out from the Agency of Education, one that I've been working with this national group called 4 Dimensions of an Instructional Leader, and they're amazing, and the task team really liked them. So before I distributed them, I went and asked if I could use them, like do the copyright thing, and the person that emailed me is my coach through my academy. She's like, well, of course you can use that, and then you can use this resource and this resource. It's like, so cool. So those connections were pretty neat.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Questions? I just have a comment. Thank you, Beth, for the board notes this month and the superintendent report. I felt better prepared for this meeting. I thought it was a very thorough job and it helped me. And I really appreciate that and wanted you to know that.
Thank you. We've been trying to figure out a good system for board notes. Maybe we're on to something, Brian.
Okay. Testing, communications, do you have anything?
I don't think so. Voices, no, we're.
All right, agenda items for January 8th.
I just have a question. I don't recall when we last read building equity, if we determined what the reading assignment was and when we were doing that next.
Thank you, Kelly. So it must be chapter 3.
Opportunities to learn, just did that chapter with the staff here today. Good. Do you want to do that for the next time we meet on the 8th?
Yeah, I think so, yes. I mean, we'll go through the work plan and we'll do all the regular stuff. So really this question is there something unusual that you want us to consider?
Is the audit going to be done?
Ooh.
No, not by January 8th.
Okay, good question. All right, if you think of something, email me. And messages to the community, I think talking about meeting with our legislators, and perhaps including who attended. I think that's always a good idea. And saying that the folks who couldn't attend had conflicts. So everyone responded to me. Nobody brushed us off. I think the transportation policy clearly,
maybe the student report.
I was looking at that and trying to decide. I think just saying they did it would be good, and then if you can synthesize.
Can we ask them further, because they handed us a printed report, can we link it in the minutes and just capture the big topics, shared information from PLPs in our district and outside of our district, and then
Yeah,
I don't know,
student
whatever,
gov.
Yeah.
student government
Yeah.
update, whatever those big categories were, and then it's just a link and then minutes
Yeah.
or
That's a
whatever.
good idea. Do you have the written? So could you scan it and make it? Okay, great.
Yeah, yeah, Kim has, I gave her one.
Okay. All right, are we all set? We are adjourned.